Your wife gave birth. She's in the ICU. Can you come to the hospital? I received a strange call and went. But my wife died 5 years ago. Look, I'm not saying I'm a coffee snob, but when you're on your third cup before noon and it tastes like someone dissolved a tire in hot water and called it artisan blend, you start questioning your life choices. That's where I was at, physically present in the break room at Henderson and Associates, spiritually somewhere between giving up and giving even less of a damn. The fluorescent lights above me hummed like they were judging my existence, which, honestly, fair. I was wearing the same pants I'd worn Monday. My shirt had a mystery stain that could have been ketchup or evidence of a crime scene, and I was pretty sure my breath could strip paint off walls. It was Tuesday. Just another soul-crushing, mind-numbing, why did a major in marketing Tuesday? My phone sat next to my keyboard like a loaded gun, silent and ominous. I should have known better than to assume the universe would let me finish my coffee in peace. The thing about tragedy is that it doesn't announce itself with trumpets and a red carpet. It shows up like an ex at a party, uninvited and ready to ruin your whole vibe. When that phone rang, the screen lighting up with Northwestern Medical Center, I remember thinking it was probably a scam. You know the type. Hello, sir. We've been trying to reach you about your car's extended warranty. Also, you're dying. Please send Bitcoin. I almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. But something in my gut, that primal instinct that keeps humans from eating poisonous berries and trusting politicians, made me pick up. Mr. Brooks. The voice on the other end was female, professional, and had that particular tone that nurses use when they're about to deliver news that'll make you reconsider your religious beliefs. She sounded like she was reading from a script, like she'd made this exact call 17 times already today, and I was just another checkbox on her list of people whose lives were about to implode. Your wife just gave birth. She's in the ICU. You should come now. I froze. My coffee cup hovered halfway between the table and my mouth, suspended in the kind of moment where time doesn't exactly stop, but it definitely starts walking really, really slowly. My brain did that thing where it tries to process information that doesn't compute, like trying to run Windows 95 on a quantum computer. It just kept buffering. Wife, birth, ICU. Those 3 words strung together like some kind of cosmic prank, a Mad Lib from hell. I almost spat the coffee all over my desk, and knowing my luck, it would have landed directly on the quarterly reports I'd been pretending to work on for the past week. My what did what now? I managed to choke out, and I'm not proud of how my voice cracked like I was going through puberty again. Smooth, Brooks. Real smooth. The nurse, bless her heart or curse her efficiency, didn't miss a beat. She repeated the information like she was telling me my pizza delivery was running late, not that my deceased spouse had apparently moonlighted as a maternity ward patient. Calm, professional, completely unaware that she'd just called the ghost department, the paranormal activity hotline, the Twilight Zone customer service center. My wife's dead, I said flatly, and hearing those words come out of my mouth felt like swallowing glass. Even after 5 years, saying it out loud never got easier. It was a fact I'd accepted, grieved, and built a whole new miserable existence around. Claire had died in a car crash, twisted metal, shattered glass, the kind of tragedy that makes the evening news and ruins dinner conversations. I'd identified the body. I'd picked out a casket that cost more than my first car. I'd stood at her funeral while people I barely knew told me she was in a better place and watching over me, which, if you ask me, sounds less like comfort and more like she got stuck with the worst surveillance job in the afterlife. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a pause so pregnant it could have been in the ICU itself. I could practically hear the nurse's brain trying to reboot, searching for the chapter in her training manual titled, "What to Do When the Husband Says the Patient is Dead, but She's Definitely Not." "Well, congratulations anyway, sir," she finally said, and I swear I could hear the confusion wrapped in forced politeness. "She's in critical condition." Click. The line went dead. Just like that. No explanation. No, sorry for the confusion. No, perhaps you'd like to speak with our psychiatry department. Just a dial tone that sounded like the universe laughing at me. I sat there staring at my phone like it had just delivered a prophecy, cursed me in ancient Greek, or told me I'd won the lottery in hell. My coworkers in the break room. Janet from accounting with her sad desk salad, Mike from IT with his comic book lunch bag, and Teresa the receptionist who always smelled like lavender and broken dreams. They all froze mid-chew, mid-sip, mid whatever mundane thing they were doing. You could have heard a pin drop, or in this case, you could have heard my sanity cracking like a glow stick at a rave. Either heaven's running a maternity ward now. I muttered, loud enough for them to hear, but quiet enough to maintain the illusion that I wasn't completely losing it. Or someone's got serious explaining to do. Janet's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Mike's energy drink paused at his lips like he'd been hit with a freeze ray. Teresa just blinked at me with those wide eyes that said she was already mentally composing the email to HR about the guy in marketing having a breakdown in the break room. Nobody said anything. What could they say? Hope your ghost wife feels better. Congrats on the zombie baby. There's no Hallmark card for this situation, no supportive emoji that captures your dead spouse just gave birth and you might be in a psychological thriller. I stood up, my chair scraping against the linoleum floor with a sound that felt way too dramatic for a Tuesday morning. My coffee sat there, still steaming, still tasting like existential crisis in liquid form. I grabbed my jacket, the one with the broken zipper I kept meaning to fix but never did because apparently I was too busy preparing for supernatural emergencies, and headed for the door. My keys jingled in my pocket like tiny bells announcing the arrival of chaos. Behind me, I could feel my coworkers' stares burning holes in my back, their silent questions hanging in the air thicker than the smell of microwaved fish that someone had nuked in there last week. As I walked through the office toward the elevator, passing cubicles full of people pretending to work while actually online shopping and scrolling through social media, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into a trap. Not the kind with ropes and tigers, but the kind that life sets up when it decides you've been too comfortable lately. When the universe looks at your boring existence and thinks, you know what would be hilarious? But here's the thing about traps. You can see them coming and still walk right into them. Because sometimes, even when your brain is screaming that this is a terrible idea, that you should call the police or a priest, or maybe just get really drunk and pretend this never happened, your legs keep moving forward anyway. The elevator doors opened with that familiar ding, and I stepped inside, watching my reflection in the brushed metal doors as they closed. I looked like a man who'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes, which tracked because that's pretty much how I felt. My finger hovered over the lobby button, and for just a second, I considered pressing the button for the roof instead. Not for anything dramatic. I'm not that guy, but because maybe up there, with the wind and the sky and the pigeons who judged me less than my coworkers, I could think clearly. Figure out if I was having a mental breakdown or if reality had just decided to rewrite the rules without consulting me first. But I pressed L for lobby because apparently I'm the kind of guy who drives toward haunted hospitals instead of running screaming in the opposite direction. The elevator descended, my stomach dropped, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a little voice that sounded suspiciously like my dead wife whispered, "You're not ready for this." And you know what? That voice was absolutely right. I got in my car anyway, because apparently, when life hands you a supernatural crisis, the appropriate response is to buckle up and drive straight into it like you're headed to pick up dry cleaning. My Honda Civic, a 2015 model with a dent on the passenger side from when I backed into a shopping cart like an idiot, a check engine light that's been on since the Obama administration, and seats that smelled like old French fries and regret, sat in the parking garage looking about as enthusiastic about this journey as I felt. Which is to say, not at all. But there I was, sliding behind the wheel, adjusting the rearview mirror that never stayed in place, and turning the key in the ignition while my hands shook like I'd mainlined espresso straight into my veins. The rational part of my brain, the part that paid taxes on time and remembered to floss occasionally, was screaming at me to turn around, call the police, maybe check myself into the nearest psychiatric facility for a wellness check. Because let's be real here, normal people don't get phone calls from hospitals claiming their dead wives just gave birth. Normal people don't nod along and think, yeah, sure, let me just drive over there and sort this out. Normal people call lawyers or priests or those ghost hunter guys from cable TV who always find evidence in the form of creaky floorboards and their own heavy breathing. But I guess I'd stopped being normal about 5 years ago, right around the time I had to pick out what my wife would wear for eternity and pretend that mattered. 5 years. 5 long, brutal, soul-crushing years since Claire, my wife, my partner, the woman who used to steal my hoodies and leave passive-aggressive notes on the fridge about whose turn it was to buy milk, died in a crash. Not just any crash, but the kind that makes the news, the kind where they use words like catastrophic and no survivors, and make you fill out so much paperwork you start wondering if hell is just an eternal DMV. I'd identified her body, or what was left of it, in a room so cold and sterile it felt like they were storing meat, which I guess they kind of were. I'd buried her on a Thursday because apparently, death doesn't care about your schedule. I'd mourned her through an entire winter where every day felt like wading through concrete. And I'd survived, barely, enough casseroles from sympathetic neighbors to last a lifetime, each one delivered with sad eyes and the phrase, "Let me know if you need anything," which we all know is code for, "I'm glad this isn't happening to me." Mrs. Henderson from next door had brought me tuna casserole. Tuna. Who does that? That's not comfort food. That's a war crime in a glass dish. Then there was Bob from across the street with his famous green bean surprise, which was surprising only in how it managed to taste like absolutely nothing and everything wrong simultaneously. My cousin Diane had shown up with something she called grief lasagna, which I'm pretty sure was just regular lasagna, but she felt the need to theme it. For months, my freezer looked like a casserole graveyard, a monument to other people's discomfort with my tragedy. I'd eaten them all anyway, standing over the sink at 2 in the morning, because cooking for one felt like admitting she was really gone. But now, apparently, someone claiming to be her had just gave birth, past tense, to a whole human baby, which meant that either I was losing my mind in the most creative way possible, or someone out there had a lot of explaining to do and possibly a very good lawyer on speed dial. I pulled out of the parking garage, squinting against the afternoon sun that seemed way too cheerful for the existential nightmare I was driving into. The radio was playing some pop song about love and summer and good vibes, which felt like the universe was deliberately mocking me. I punched it off so hard I nearly broke the button. Traffic on I-94 was, of course, a complete nightmare, because Chicago traffic doesn't care if you're having a personal crisis. There were minivans full of screaming kids, BMWs with drivers who thought turn signals were optional, and at least 3 cars with those stick-figure family decals that made me want to ram into them just on principle. I was stuck behind a truck hauling furniture, going approximately 5 miles per hour, and every second felt like an eternity. My mind started doing what it does best when left unsupervised, spiraling into increasingly ridiculous scenarios. Halfway to the hospital, gridlocked between an Uber that smelled like someone had died in it, and a Tesla with a vanity plate that said Crypt 0, I started bargaining with the universe out loud like a lunatic. "Okay, listen up, Cosmos," I said to my windshield, which had a crack spreading across it like a spider web. "If this is some twisted prank, if this is hidden cameras or some elaborate scam, I'm egging someone's car. Not just any car. I'm talking a dozen eggs, maybe 2. The expensive free-range organic ones. I'll throw in some toilet paper for good measure. I'll make it look like Halloween and a grocery store had a baby." A guy in the lane next to me glanced over and quickly looked away, probably adding "talking to himself in traffic" to his list of red flags for the day. The traffic light ahead turned red for the 15th time, and I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. What if it really was her? What if Claire had somehow survived, faked her death, and spent 5 years doing what? Living a secret life? Running from something? Starting over with a new identity, like she was in witness protection? And if it was her, why? Why would she let me think she was dead? Why would she put me through the worst years of my life? Make me sit through a funeral where I had to watch them lower her casket into the ground? Make me learn how to sleep alone in a bed that felt too big? Make me figure out how to exist in a world where she wasn't? Or maybe, and this seemed increasingly likely given my luck, it wasn't her at all. Maybe it was someone who looked like her, some cosmic coincidence, a glitch in the matrix. Maybe I was about to walk into that hospital and come face to face with a stranger who just happened to have the same face as my dead wife, and I'd have to explain to hospital security why I was having a meltdown in the ICU. "Sorry, officer. I thought she was my deceased spouse, my bad. I'll just see myself out and directly into therapy." By the time I pulled into Northwestern Medical's parking structure, a concrete monstrosity that charged $15 for the privilege of parking in a space designed for toy cars, I was sweating like I'd run a marathon in a sauna wearing a parka. My shirt was sticking to my back, my hands were clammy, and I'm pretty sure I'd stress-eaten all the mints in my glove compartment without realizing it. The parking garage smelled like exhaust and desperation, which felt appropriate. I circled the floors like a shark looking for prey, passing soccer moms in SUVs, medical residents in beat-up Hondas, and one guy in a Porsche who was definitely compensating for something. Finally, I found a spot on the fourth floor, wedged between a minivan with a baby on board sticker and a pickup truck that was definitely violating some parking regulations. I sat there for a moment, engine off, hands still gripping the wheel, staring at the concrete wall in front of me like it held the answers to the universe. It didn't. It just had some graffiti that said Jake was here and a suspicious stain that I didn't want to think about. Okay, Brooks, I said to myself, because apparently, I'd become the kind of person who gives themselves pep talks in parking garages. You've got two options here. Option 1. You turn around, drive home, pour yourself a very large drink, and pretend this never happened. Option 2. You go in there and face whatever fresh hell is waiting for you behind that glass door. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked terrible, bags under my eyes, hair sticking up like I'd been electrocuted, and an expression that said I'd given up on life somewhere around 2020. Option 2 it is, you absolute idiot. I got out of the car, locked it twice because paranoia is a lifestyle, and headed toward the elevator. My footsteps echoed in the empty garage, each step feeling heavier than the last. The elevator doors opened with a ding that sounded way too cheerful, revealing a small metal box covered in hand sanitizer dispensers and signs about flu season. I stepped inside, pressed the button for the main floor, and watched the doors close, sealing me in with my terrible decisions. Because let's be honest here, if my dead wife was somehow in the ICU giving birth, I didn't need a parking ticket or a therapist or even a stiff drink. I needed a priest, an exorcist, maybe one of those psychics who charge $200 an hour to tell you what you want to hear. I needed answers that made sense in a world that had stopped making sense the moment my phone rang in that break room. The elevator descended, my stomach dropped along with it, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to walk into something that would either explain everything or shatter what little remained of my sanity. The doors opened to the main lobby, all white walls and hand sanitizer smell, and people in scrubs looking exhausted. I stepped out, took a deep breath that tasted like recycled air and medical-grade anxiety, and headed toward the front desk. Whatever was waiting for me up in that ICU, ghost, doppelganger, or bureaucratic nightmare, I was about to find out. And knowing my luck, it would probably be all three. At the front desk, a nurse named Tina blinked at me like I'd just materialized out of thin air, which, given the circumstances, felt weirdly appropriate. Her name tag was slightly crooked, pinned to scrubs covered in cartoon stethoscopes that were probably meant to make sick people feel better, but just made me feel like I was in a children's hospital designed by someone who'd given up on subtlety. She had that look. You know the one, where service industry professionals master the art of looking simultaneously helpful and dead inside. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail so tight it could have been classified as a facelift, and she had a coffee stain on her sleeve that told me she was having just as great a day as I was. "Are you Mr. Brooks?" she asked, glancing down at a clipboard that looked like it had seen better days, probably better years if we're being honest. Her voice had that practiced customer service tone that people use when they're required to be polite, but would rather be literally anywhere else. I respected it. We were kindred spirits in our mutual desire to not be having this conversation. "Depends," I said, leaning against the counter because my legs had apparently decided they were done holding me up. Am I about to meet a zombie or a lawsuit? I tried for humor because that's what I do when I'm terrified, make inappropriate jokes that make people uncomfortable. It's a gift, really. A terrible, socially unacceptable gift that's gotten me in trouble at every funeral I've ever attended. She squinted at me, her eyes doing that thing where they try to figure out if you're joking or having a mental breakdown. In my case, it was definitely both. She clicked her pen, one of those cheap hospital pens that never works right and probably costs taxpayers $7 each, and consulted her paperwork like it was the Dead Sea Scrolls. "Your wife just delivered a baby girl. Complications, but stable." She said it so matter-of-factly, like she was telling me my prescription was ready or my table at Olive Garden was available. No drama, no acknowledgement that what she'd just said violated every law of physics and human decency. "My wife's dead," I said flatly, and the words hung in the air between us like an accusation. Around us, the hospital lobby continued its usual chaos. People checking in, checking out, looking miserable in waiting room chairs that were specifically designed to be uncomfortable. An old guy was arguing with the vending machine. A kid was crying while his mom tried to convince him that shots weren't that bad, which was a lie and everyone knew it. Life just kept going, completely indifferent to the fact that my reality was currently doing backflips. Tina smiled politely, the kind of smile that people give you when you've just said something that doesn't compute, but they're too professional to call you out on it. It was the smile of someone who'd seen everything in this job. People high on painkillers, families fighting over medical decisions, patients trying to escape in hospital gowns, and had decided that nothing could surprise her anymore. She looked at me like I'd just told her I didn't like gluten or that I was vegan or some other inconvenient, but ultimately manageable dietary restriction. "Then you're in for a surprise," she said, and there was something in her voice, maybe pity, maybe amusement, maybe just exhaustion, that made my stomach drop even further than it already had. She handed me a visitor's pass that was printed on the cheapest sticker paper known to man, the kind that would leave residue on my shirt for weeks. "4th floor ICU. Room 427. Just follow the blue line on the floor." She pointed at a strip of blue tape that wound through the hospital like some kind of depressing yellow brick road, except instead of leading to a wizard, it led to my personal nightmare. And boy, was I in for a surprise. Because surprises aren't just birthday parties and unexpected pizza deliveries. Sometimes surprises are like landmines disguised as daily activities, just waiting for you to step wrong. I followed that blue line like it was my death march, passing doctors who looked like they hadn't slept since medical school, nurses doing their best to keep people alive despite the system working against them, and visitors who all had that same glazed look that said they'd been sitting in waiting rooms so long they'd forgotten what natural sunlight looked like. The elevator to the 4th floor smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. I shared it with an elderly woman who was clutching a teddy bear and softly crying, which felt like an omen, but I was already committed to this disaster. The doors opened with a ding that sounded like the universe laughing, and I stepped out into the ICU floor, where everything was beeping and humming and generally giving off the vibe that people came here to either get better or give up entirely. Room 427 was at the end of a hallway that felt twice as long as it actually was. Each step felt like wading through concrete, my shoes squeaking on linoleum floors that had been waxed so many times they were practically mirrors. I could see my reflection in them, a guy who looked like he'd aged 15 years in the last hour, wearing a wrinkled shirt and an expression that screamed, "I've made a huge mistake." When I got to the window, that big glass panel that lets you peer into ICU rooms like you're at an aquarium, except instead of fish, it's people clinging to life, I stopped, my hand pressed against the glass, leaving a sweaty palm print that some janitor would curse me for later. And there she was, through that window, lying in a hospital bed surrounded by more machines than a Radio Shack going out of business, was Claire. Not someone who looked like Claire. Not a Claire-adjacent person. Claire. Same face that I'd memorized during 3 years of marriage and 5 years of grief. Same high cheekbones that she'd always said made her look sophisticated, but I'd always thought made her look like trouble, which she was. Same small nose that she'd hated but I'd loved. Same lips that used to smile at my terrible jokes and tell me I was an idiot in the most affectionate way possible. And there it was, same mole under her left eye. That tiny beauty mark, barely visible unless you were close enough to count her freckles, which I had been, many times. It was her signature, her identifier, the thing that made her face hers and not anyone else's. I used to kiss that mole every morning before work. This stupid ritual we'd started on our honeymoon and never stopped. She'd always laugh and push me away, but I knew she loved it. That mole was proof. Undeniable, unmistakable proof. The same woman who died 5 years ago was lying in that bed, pale and unconscious but real, breathing with the help of machines that beeped in rhythm like a heartbeat. Her chest rose and fell slowly, mechanically, and I could see an 4-line running into her arm, monitors tracking vitals that shouldn't exist. Her hair was different, shorter, darker, like she'd been trying to become someone else, but it was her. Her face, her hands, her everything. She looked thinner than I remembered, like life had been rough on her, which raised about 1 million questions I wasn't ready to answer. Either I was hallucinating, and if I was, props to my brain for the attention to detail, really committing to the bit, or heaven had a return policy that nobody had bothered to mention in Sunday school. Maybe there was a celestial customer service department where dead people could file complaints. Yes, hello. I'd like to return this afterlife. It's not quite what I expected. The reviews were misleading. Maybe Claire had found the receipt and demanded to speak to God's manager. Maybe I was having a stroke, and this was just my brain's final, elaborate prank before shutting down permanently. A doctor appeared next to me, materializing like doctors do when you're having a moment. He was tall, probably 6'2", with silver hair that looked professionally styled, and a white coat so pristine it could have been in a detergent commercial. His face had that generic doctor look, concerned but detached, professional but not quite human, like he'd practiced his bedside manner in front of a mirror until he got it just right. His name tag said Dr. Evans, and he looked like the kind of guy who drove a Mercedes and had strong opinions about wine. "Mr. Brooks?" he asked, even though he obviously knew who I was. Doctors love doing that, asking questions they already know the answers to. It's like a power move, establishing dominance through unnecessary confirmation. I nodded, not trusting my voice to work properly. My throat felt like I'd swallowed sand, and my brain was still trying to process the fact that my dead wife was 20 feet away, separated by glass and 5 years of grief that suddenly felt wasted. "I'm Dr. Evans, head of the ICU unit. We need to talk." He gestured toward a small consultation room nearby, one of those awful spaces with uncomfortable chairs and a box of tissues on the table, because they knew whatever got discussed in there would probably require crying. The walls were that depressing beige color that institutions love, and there was a poster about hand washing that looked like it had been there since the 90s. I followed him in, my legs moving on autopilot while my brain lagged behind, still stuck at that window, still staring at a woman who shouldn't exist. We sat down, him on one side of a table that had seen too many difficult conversations, me on the other, feeling like I was about to get fired from life itself. "She was admitted under your name," he began, folding his hands on the table in that way doctors do when they're about to deliver news that's going to ruin your month. "Anna Brooks. Delivered via emergency C-section 3 hours ago. Baby girl, 6 pounds 4 ounces, healthy despite the circumstances. Mother coded twice during delivery, but we got her back. She's stable now, but critical. No ID when she came in, just a hospital ban from a previous admission we can't track down, and your name listed as next of kin." I let that sink in, which was like trying to absorb an ocean with a paper towel. Anna Brooks. Not Claire. Anna. Someone had given my dead wife a new name, a new identity, a whole new existence. And then that someone had put my name down as family, dragging me into whatever soap opera nightmare this was turning out to be. "Doctor," I said, leaning forward in my chair until it creaked in protest, probably because even the furniture could sense this conversation was about to go sideways. "Are you sure she didn't crawl out of a crypt first? Because I'm trying to figure out if I need a lawyer or a priest, and honestly, I'm leaning toward both." My voice came out sharper than I intended, but can you blame me? The man was sitting there all calm and collected, like he hadn't just told me my dead wife had delivered a baby under a fake name while I was drinking garbage coffee at work. Dr. Evans didn't even blink. I'll give him credit. The man had the emotional range of a textbook, which I guess is what happens when you spend your entire career delivering bad news to people in consultation rooms that smell like sanitizer and despair. He just looked at me with those steady, professional eyes that had probably seen every reaction known to humanity and filed them all under expected responses to trauma. "Sir, I understand this is difficult," he said, which was the understatement of the century. Difficult? Difficult is parallel parking. Difficult is assembling IKEA furniture. This was a full-blown existential crisis wrapped in a medical mystery with a side of supernatural implications. But right now, we need next-of-kin authorization for continued care and decision-making purposes. There are forms to sign, insurance information to verify, and— "Oh, great," I interrupted, throwing my hands up in a gesture that probably looked unhinged but felt completely justified. "I get paperwork from the afterlife. That's fantastic. Really, what's next? Am I going to have to file a tax return for a ghost? Do I need to report resurrection as income?" I was spiraling. I knew I was spiraling. But the alternative was accepting that this was really happening, and my brain wasn't ready for that level of reality. He slid a clipboard across the table, one of those industrial-strength hospital clipboards that probably cost $40 and could double as a weapon. It was loaded with forms, consent forms, privacy forms, financial responsibility forms, forms about forms. The American healthcare system in all its bureaucratic glory, now demanding I sign my name in triplicate to acknowledge that my supposedly dead wife had given birth. We need someone to make medical decisions if her condition deteriorates. Since you're listed as her emergency contact, I'm her what now? I grabbed the clipboard, scanning the paperwork with the kind of manic energy that comes from pure confusion mixed with rage. And there it was, printed in that terrible hospital font that looks like it was designed to cause headaches. Emergency contact, Marcus Brooks. My name, my phone number, my address from 5 years ago, before I moved to a smaller apartment, because living in our old place felt like haunting my own life. Dr. Evans continued in that measured voice, probably the same tone he used to explain terminal diagnoses and experimental treatments. The patient was brought in by ambulance approximately 4 hours ago, in active labor and unresponsive. No identification, no insurance cards, nothing. Just that hospital band and the intake form from what appears to be prenatal visits we have no record of. We tried the emergency contact number, which led us to you. And nobody thought this was weird? I asked, looking up from the forms that might as well have been written in ancient Greek for all the sense they made to my overloaded brain. Nobody stopped and said, "Hey, maybe we should investigate why this woman has no ID, no history, and an emergency contact who thinks she's been dead for half a decade." Sir, our priority is patient care, not detective work. That's for administration and possibly law enforcement to sort out. He stood up, signaling that this conversation was wrapping up whether I was ready or not. But right now, she needs someone to authorize treatment, and legally, you're it. I'll give you some time to process, but we need those signatures today. Then he did something that almost made me respect him. He paused at the door, and his professional mask slipped just a fraction. For what it's worth, Mr. Brooks, in 20 years of medicine, I've never seen anything quite like this. I don't know what's going on here, but that woman in there fought hard to survive delivery. Whatever her story is, she wanted to live. He left, closing the door with a soft click that sounded way too final. I sat there alone with my thoughts and a clipboard full of paperwork that would determine the fate of a woman who was either my wife, a doppelganger, or proof that I'd finally snapped. The consultation room felt smaller suddenly, the walls closing in with their depressing beige paint and motivational posters about washing hands and staying positive. How was I supposed to stay positive about this? Through the small window in the door, I could see nurses rushing past, visitors looking lost, the whole organized chaos of a hospital operating exactly as designed. Normal people dealing with normal medical emergencies, broken bones, infections, scheduled surgeries. Meanwhile, I was sitting in a room trying to figure out if I should sign forms for a woman who died in my arms 5 years ago, who I'd buried, mourned, and somehow never managed to fully move on from. I looked at the forms again. They wanted me to make decisions about her care, to be responsible for medical choices that could mean life or death. Me, the guy who couldn't decide what to have for lunch without having an anxiety attack. The same guy who still had her toothbrush in the bathroom because throwing it away felt too permanent. They wanted me to be an adult, to handle this situation with grace and maturity. Either I'm having the world's most elaborate hallucination, I said to the empty room, or someone out there faked my wife's death and is about to get the kind of visit that makes people rethink their life choices. Possibly both. I grabbed the pen attached to the clipboard. One of those cheap ones on a metal chain like hospitals think people are trying to steal their terrible pens, and started signing. Because what else was I going to do? Walk away? Let her die a second time? Yeah, right. Like I could live with that. While the nurse tried to reach the listed emergency contact, because apparently I wasn't the only person in this nightmare scenario, I watched her dial a number from the intake paperwork with fingers that moved too fast for someone dealing with what should have been a routine call. Her name was Sandra, according to her badge, and she had the look of someone who'd worked double shifts for so long she'd forgotten what her own bed looked like. She punched in the numbers, held the phone to her ear, and waited while I stood there like an idiot, eavesdropping on what was about to become the second most uncomfortable phone call of the day. She read the name aloud from the form, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of beeping monitors and distant intercoms paging doctors to various emergencies. Emergency contact, Andrew Gray. The moment those two words left her mouth, my stomach twisted into a knot so tight it could have been used for rock climbing. Andrew freaking Gray. That name hit me like a freight train loaded with betrayal and bad memories. The same Andrew Gray who'd been my college roommate, my best man at my wedding, the guy who'd helped me move into my first apartment and stayed up all night assembling furniture while we argued about sports and drank cheap beer. The same Andrew who'd mysteriously vanished from my life right around the time Claire died, like a ghost who'd realized he'd overstayed his welcome at the haunting. I remembered the last time I'd seen him, at Claire's funeral, actually, which now felt sickeningly ironic. He'd stood in the back, wearing a black suit that looked too expensive for someone who claimed he was between jobs. He'd shaken my hand, mumbled some generic condolence about how sorry he was, and then disappeared before the reception. I tried calling him a few weeks later, needing a friend, needing someone who knew Claire and could help me process the loss. His number was disconnected. His apartment was empty. His social media went dark. He'd vanished like he'd never existed at all, and at the time, I'd been too destroyed by grief to wonder why. Oh, perfect. Just perfect. My ghost wife had ghost connections. This was turning into some kind of paranormal soap opera, the kind where everyone's connected in ways that make you want to throw your TV out the window. What was next? Was my mailman secretly my long-lost brother? Was my dentist actually a time traveler? At this point, nothing would surprise me. Sandra held the phone away from her ears slightly, and I could hear it ringing. Once, twice, 3 times. Pick up, you coward, I thought. Pick up and explain why your name is on my dead wife's emergency contact list. On the 4th ring, someone answered, and I watched Sandra's face shift from professional neutral to slightly confused. Hello, this is Northwestern Medical Center calling for Andrew Gray, she said in that practiced hospital voice that somehow managed to sound both urgent and casual. We have a patient here, Anna Brooks, who listed you as an emergency contact. She's just given birth in. A man's voice on the other end, muffled but audible enough that I could hear the confusion even from where I stood. Anna Brooks? Are you sure? He sounded genuinely bewildered, like he'd been asked about someone he'd never heard of, which only made this whole situation more infuriating. Either he was a fantastic liar or he was just as confused as the rest of us, and I wasn't sure which option made me angrier. Yeah, buddy, we're sure. Super sure. Absolutely certain that your name is written right here next to a woman who looks exactly like my supposedly dead wife, but is apparently going by a name that sounds like she picked it out of a witness protection handbook. I'm sure about all of it, except the part where any of this makes sense. Sandra continued, reading from her script like she'd done this 1,000 times, which she probably had. Yes, sir. Anna Brooks. You're listed as her emergency contact. She's in critical condition following delivery, and we need someone to come down and provide information if possible. Are you able to come to the hospital? There was a pause on the other end, the kind of pause that speaks volumes. I could practically hear him thinking, calculating, trying to figure out what to say. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed, less confused, more resigned, like he'd just remembered something he'd been trying to forget. I'll be there right away, he said, and those 5 words felt like a confession. I muttered under my breath, just loud enough for Sandra to glance at me with concern. Of course you will. Because apparently, betrayal has excellent GPS, probably uses ways to avoid traffic and moral accountability. I could already picture him in his car, probably something ridiculous like a Lexus or a BMW. Definitely something with heated seats and a sound system that cost more than my monthly rent. Navigating through the same Chicago traffic I'd just survived, coming to the hospital like he had any right to be here. Sandra hung up and looked at me with an expression that was part sympathy, part this is above my pay grade. She probably dealt with family drama all the time. Divorced parents fighting over custody, siblings arguing about pulling plugs, relatives crawling out of the woodwork when someone's dying with money, but this had to be a new one even for her. He said he'll be here within the hour, she informed me, making a note on her paperwork. Do you know Mr. Gray, sir? Yeah, I said, my voice coming out bitter and sharp like coffee that's been sitting on the burner too long. Yeah, I know him. Or at least I thought I did. Turns out I don't know much of anything anymore. I looked back toward the ICU room where Claire, or Anna, or whoever she was pretending to be, lay unconscious, connected to machines that were keeping her alive, while the truth stayed buried under layers of lies and fake names. Sandra nodded like she understood, even though she absolutely didn't and couldn't. "I'll let you know when he arrives," she said, already turning back to her computer because hospitals don't stop running just because your life is falling apart. There were other patients, other emergencies, other families having their own personal catastrophes in consultation rooms up and down this floor. I walked back to that window, pressed my forehead against the cool glass, and stared at the woman who'd apparently decided that faking her death and living a secret life was preferable to whatever we'd had together. The machines beeped their steady rhythm, indifferent to the chaos swirling around them. Somewhere in this building, Andrew Gray was on his way, probably rehearsing whatever story he'd concocted to explain why his name was tangled up in this mess. 5 years, I whispered to the glass, my breath fogging it up. 5 years I thought you were gone, and all this time. I couldn't finish the sentence because I didn't know how it ended. All this time what? She'd been alive? She'd been with him? She'd been running? She'd been planning to come back? The only thing I knew for certain was that when Andrew walked through those doors, he and I were going to have a conversation that was 5 years overdue. And it wasn't going to be pretty. When Andrew walked in, he looked like life had been kind to him. Too kind. The kind of kind that makes you want to punch kindness right in its smug face. He was wearing a tailored suit that probably cost more than my car, charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes that screamed, "I make 6 figures and have a financial advisor." The fabric looked expensive, the kind that doesn't wrinkle even when you've been sitting in traffic for an hour contemplating your crimes. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, probably Italian leather, definitely something with a designer name I couldn't pronounce. And there it was, gleaming on his wrist like a tiny beacon of douchebaggery, a Rolex. An actual, genuine Rolex, the kind that costs as much as a year's rent and tells you the time in 3 time zones you'll never visit. His hair was perfectly styled, that calculated messy look that requires $40 worth of product and a YouTube tutorial. He had a slight tan, like he'd just gotten back from somewhere tropical where people drink cocktails with umbrellas and don't think about their dead wives coming back to life. He looked healthy, successful, like a guy who'd made all the right choices and slept soundly at night on Egyptian cotton sheets with a thread count that had more zeros than my bank account. Meanwhile, I looked like I'd been dragged behind a bus through a car wash, wearing yesterday's shirt and the emotional stability of a Jenga tower in an earthquake. The contrast was almost funny. Almost. His face had that look people get when they're trying to seem concerned but are actually just calculating their exit strategy. You know that expression. The slightly furrowed brow, the downturned mouth, the eyes that are looking at you but also past you, already planning their next move. It was the face of a man who'd walked into a situation he'd hoped to avoid and was now stuck in it like quicksand in an expensive suit. We locked eyes across the ICU waiting area, and for a second, the whole world seemed to hold its breath. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere, a monitor beeped. A orderly pushed a cart past us, wheels squeaking on linoleum. But between us, there was just silence. The kind of silence that happens right before someone throws a punch or says something that can never be unsaid. Even the beeping machines seemed to pause, like they were waiting to see what would happen when 2 guys with a shared history of lies met in a hospital hallway. "Long time," he said casually, like we'd just bumped into each other at a coffee shop instead of a hospital where my supposedly dead wife had just given birth. His voice was smooth, practiced, the voice of someone who'd gotten very good at lying. He even managed a small smile, which took some serious audacity. I had to give him credit. The man had balls. Terrible, traitorous balls, but balls nonetheless. "Yeah," I replied, and I could hear the edge in my own voice, sharp enough to cut through his expensive suit and whatever excuses he'd prepared on the drive over. "About 5 years. Same timeline as my wife's funeral. Small world, huh?" I emphasized funeral just to watch him flinch, which he did, just slightly. A tiny crack in that professional facade, a flicker of something that might have been guilt or might have just been indigestion. His jaw tightened, and he had the nerve to look concerned, like he actually cared, like he hadn't disappeared from my life at the exact moment I'd needed friends the most. "Marcus, I didn't know," he started, and his voice had that apologetic tone that people use when they're about to deliver a rehearsed explanation that explains nothing. Save it. I cut him off, taking a step closer. I wasn't normally a confrontational guy. I was more of a write angry emails and delete them kind of person, but something about seeing him here, now, looking so put together while my life was falling apart for the second time, flipped a switch I didn't know I had. Either you two faked her death, or I'm living in a bad Netflix series, and honestly, I'm not sure which option makes me want to hit you more. A nurse, different from Sandra, this one younger with glasses and an expression that said she'd seen too many Jerry Springer episodes play out in this hallway, awkwardly cleared her throat. She'd been standing nearby, probably documentation something on her tablet, and had gotten caught in our moment of tension. "Gentlemen, please," she said, her voice firm but nervous, like a substitute teacher trying to control a classroom. "Not near the patient. We have conference rooms if you need to discuss things." I smiled tightly, the kind of smile that doesn't reach your eyes because your eyes are busy calculating whether hospital security would stop you from committing justifiable homicide. "Don't worry, I'll wait until she wakes up before the yelling starts. I'm classy like that." I looked back at Andrew, who had the decency to look uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one expensive shoe to the other. "We've got time, right, Andrew? Since apparently, we've got 5 years worth of catching up to do." He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up in a way that probably still looked intentional. "Can we talk somewhere private?" he asked, glancing around at the nurses, visitors, and other people who were definitely eavesdropping because hospital drama is free entertainment and better than whatever's on the waiting room TV. "Oh, now you want privacy?" I laughed, but it came out bitter and sharp. "That's rich. Where was this desire for privacy 5 years ago when you were apparently helping my wife fake her death? Did you guys have a private conversation about that? Maybe over dinner? Coffee? Or were you too busy planning whatever the hell this is?" I gestured toward the ICU room where Claire/Anna lay unconscious. "It's not what you think," Andrew said, which is what everyone says when it's exactly what you think. It's the universal phrase for, "It's worse than you think, but I'm going to try to spin it anyway." "Really?" I crossed my arms, a defensive posture I'd picked up from years of feeling defensive. "Because what I think is that my wife, who I watched them lower into the ground, who I mourned for 5 years, who I still can't look at pictures of without wanting to cry, is somehow alive and just gave birth. And your name is on her emergency contact list. So please, enlighten me. Tell me what I'm not understanding about this totally normal, not at all insane situation." He looked at the floor, at the walls, anywhere but at me. When people can't make eye contact, it's usually because they know they're wrong and they're hoping if they avoid looking at you, the wrongness will somehow hurt less. It doesn't work that way. "She made me promise not to tell you," he finally said, his voice quiet, almost pleading. "She said it was the only way to keep you safe." Safe. The word came out louder than I intended, and several people in the waiting area looked over. I didn't care. Safe from what? Happiness? A normal life? Knowing my wife wasn't dead? Yeah, real safe, Andrew. I feel super protected. Thanks for that. A security guard started walking our direction, a big guy with a bored expression that said he'd broken up plenty of fights in this hospital, and ours would just be another Tuesday. The nurse with glasses waved him off, mouthing, "It's okay," which was generous of her because it absolutely was not okay. Andrew looked like he wanted to disappear, and good, he should feel that way. He should feel uncomfortable and trapped and like the walls were closing in, because that's how I'd felt every single day for 5 years. "There's a conference room on the 3rd floor," he said quietly. "Let me explain everything. You deserve that much." "I deserve a lot more than that," I shot back. "But sure, let's start with an explanation and work our way up to the part where I decide whether to forgive you or ruin your life. Should be fun." The next morning, she opened her eyes. My heart nearly exploded, and I don't mean that in a romantic movie kind of way. I mean it in a, I might actually be having a cardiac event and need to crash cart kind of way. I'd spent the entire night in that horrible plastic chair next to her bed, the kind designed by someone who clearly hated the concept of human comfort. My back felt like it had been through a medieval torture device. My neck was stuck at an angle that definitely wasn't natural, and I'd consumed enough hospital coffee from the vending machine to power a small city. The stuff tasted like battery acid mixed with disappointment, but it kept me awake through the longest night of my life, watching her breathe, watching the monitors, waiting for something, anything, to make sense. Andrew had tried to explain things in that conference room last night. Something about witness protection that wasn't actually witness protection, about dangerous people, about debts and threats, and reasons why faking her death was somehow the noble choice. But his explanations had been vague, full of holes you could drive a truck through, and he'd spent more time checking his phone than making eye contact. I'd left that conversation with more questions than answers and a burning desire to punch something, preferably his face. But now, watching her eyelids flutter open for the first time in what felt like forever, all that anger took a back seat to something else. Hope, maybe, or just desperate curiosity. Her eyes moved slowly, adjusting to the harsh hospital lights that made everything look washed out and clinical. She blinked several times, confused, disoriented, like someone waking up from a dream they couldn't quite remember. The monitors around her started beeping faster as her heart rate picked up, and a nurse I hadn't seen before poked her head in, checked the machines, and gave me a nod before disappearing back into the hallway. "Claire," I whispered, leaning forward in my chair, which creaked loudly in protest, because even the furniture in this place was dramatic. My voice came out rough, scratchy from too much coffee and not enough sleep. I was gripping the bed rail so hard my knuckles had turned white, like if I held on tight enough, this moment would stay real and not dissolve into another nightmare. Her lips moved weakly, barely more than a whisper, and I had to lean in closer to hear what she was saying. The smell of hospital antiseptic mixed with whatever soap they'd used to clean her up before surgery filled my nostrils. Her voice, when it finally came out, was hoarse and broken and barely audible over the beeping machines. "Andrew," I swear I felt my soul leave my body, pack a suitcase, and order an Uber to literally anywhere else. My heart, which had been doing gymnastics just seconds ago, plummeted straight through the floor and possibly into the basement. The room suddenly felt too small, too hot, like all the oxygen had been sucked out and replaced with pure, concentrated betrayal. The beeping monitors sounded accusing, like even the machines were judging me for being stupid enough to hope. "Oh, sure," I muttered, sitting back in my chair hard enough that it nearly tipped over. My voice was thick with sarcasm and something that felt dangerously close to tears, which I absolutely refused to acknowledge. Die on me once, come back, and still call the wrong guy. Classic. Really classic, Claire. Or should I say Anna? I don't even know what to call you anymore. I ran my hands through my hair, which probably looked like a bird's nest at this point. "This is perfect. This is just perfect." She blinked again, turning her head slowly toward my voice, and I watched confusion wash over her face. Her eyes, those same eyes I'd stared into 1,000 times, that I'd memorized during late-night conversations and lazy Sunday mornings, were filled with tears that started streaming down her pale cheeks, leaving tracks through what little remained of her composure. "I can explain," she said weakly, and her voice broke on the last word. "Please do," I said, spreading my arms wide in a gesture that encompassed the entire absurd situation. The hospital room, the machines, the 5 years of lies, all of it. Because this feels like a group project where I didn't even know I was enrolled, and somehow I'm still getting graded on it. By all means, explain how you died, came back, had a baby, and your first word upon waking up is someone else's name. I'm all ears. Really, I've got nowhere else to be, and apparently, my life is a joke anyway, so let's hear the punchline. She closed her eyes again, tears still flowing, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths that the monitors tracked with their steady beeping. When she opened them again, there was something in her expression that I'd never seen before. Fear, maybe, or regret so deep it had its own gravitational pull. "My name is Anna now," she said, each word seeming to cost her energy she didn't have. "Anna Brooks. New ID, new city, new life. I had to disappear. I had to make you think. That you were dead?" I finished for her, my voice sharp. "Yeah, mission accomplished on that one. Gold star. Really stellar work. The funeral was lovely, by the way. You would have been proud. Great turnout, terrible casseroles, and I only cried in front of people like 50 times. But sure, let's talk about your new life." "Marcus, please," she pleaded, and hearing my name in her voice after 5 years of silence hit different than I expected. "I wasn't running from you. That stopped me cold." I leaned forward again, searching her face for the lie, for the angle, for whatever con this was. Then who were you running from? I asked quietly, and suddenly the anger gave way to something else. Actual concern, curiosity, maybe even the tiniest shred of understanding trying to elbow its way past my wall of resentment. She opened her mouth to answer, but then her eyes darted toward the door, and her whole body tensed up in a way that made every monitor in the room go crazy. A nurse rushed in, checking her vitals, adjusting something on the 4 line, asking if she was in pain. The moment was broken, shattered like glass, and whatever she'd been about to tell me was swallowed by the chaos of medical intervention. But in that split second before the nurse arrived, I'd seen something in her eyes that changed everything. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't shame. It was terror. Pure, primal terror, the kind that comes from real danger, not from being caught in a lie. Whatever she'd been running from, whoever she'd been hiding from, it wasn't a joke. It wasn't a scam. It was real, and it was bad enough that she'd let me believe she was dead for 5 years just to keep it away from me. Turns out, her name was Anna now. New ID, new city, new life. She'd faked her death to escape me. Or so she thought. But here's the real twist. The one that Andrew had been dancing around all night in that conference room with his vague explanations and his guilty face. She wasn't running from me. She was running from someone else. Someone bad enough that disappearing was the only option. Someone dangerous enough that involving me would have gotten me killed. And judging by the fear in her eyes and the way she kept glancing at that door like she expected someone to walk through it at any moment, whoever she was running from might not be done chasing her. "We need to talk," I said to her quietly, while the nurse fussed with machines and pretended not to eavesdrop. "When you're ready, when you're strong enough, we need to talk about everything. About why you ran, about who you're afraid of, about that baby in the nursery who doesn't have any idea what kind of mess she's been born into. But mostly," I paused, making sure she was looking at me, really looking at me. "Mostly, we need to talk about what happens next. Because Anna, or Claire, or whoever you are now, this doesn't end here." She told me everything in broken sentences between tears and exhaustion, her voice fading in and out like a radio station with bad reception. The nurse had finally left us alone after extracting a promise that I wouldn't upset her further, which was rich considering my entire existence had been upset for 5 years straight. The monitors continued their steady beeping, a soundtrack to the worst story I'd ever heard. And trust me, I'd sat through my cousin's 3-hour presentation about his cryptocurrency investments, so that was saying something. After the crash, and it really had been a crash, she assured me, like that somehow made it better, someone had pulled her from the wreckage before emergency services arrived. Not a good Samaritan. Not a passerby with a hero complex. Someone who'd been waiting, watching, expecting her to be there. The car accident hadn't been an accident at all. It had been a message, a warning, a "you're next" from people she'd inadvertently crossed paths with through her job at the accounting firm. She'd seen something she wasn't supposed to see, stumbled across numbers that didn't add up, transactions that led to very bad people doing very bad things. Andrew had been there that night. Pure coincidence, or so he claimed. Wrong place, right time, depending on how you looked at it. He'd helped her vanish, gave her a new name, new documents, promised her protection. "He saved my life," she whispered, and I wanted to point out that he'd also ruined mine. But I kept my mouth shut because she was crying and hooked up to machines, and I wasn't that much of a monster. Yet. Except Andrew wasn't a savior. Not even close. He was a scammer with a side hustle in human misery. He'd used her new identity as cover for money laundering through fake medical research, foundations, charity organizations that existed only on paper and in bank accounts in countries that didn't ask too many questions. She'd been his shield, his alibi, his "see, there's a real person behind this," totally legitimate stamp of approval. And she'd gone along with it because what choice did she have? The people she was running from were still out there, still looking, and Andrew was the only thing standing between her and whatever fate they had planned. "So he's the father?" I asked, and my voice came out flat, dead, like I'd used up all my emotional range and was running on empty. "The baby. The whole reason we were here. 6 pounds 4 ounces of innocent life caught in the middle of this absolute dumpster fire. Biologically, yes," she said weakly, not meeting my eyes. She stared at the ceiling tiles, counting them maybe, or praying to them. or just avoiding looking at the disappointment on my face. It wasn't. It wasn't supposed to happen. When I got pregnant, he panicked. Said it was too complicated, too risky. He disappeared 6 months ago. Changed his number, moved addresses, left me with nothing but a fake ID and medical bills I couldn't pay under a name that wasn't real. I sighed, a deep, exhausted sound that came from somewhere in my bones. Of course, I get all the drama, none of the child tax credits. The joke fell flat because nothing was funny anymore. Nothing had been funny for a very long time. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw someone I didn't recognize. This wasn't the Claire who'd laughed at my terrible puns and burned breakfast every Sunday. This was Anna, whoever that was, a stranger wearing my wife's face and carrying 5 years of secrets that had aged her in ways that time alone couldn't explain. But something shifted inside me right then, something fundamental that I hadn't felt since the funeral. She wasn't the villain of my story anymore. She'd never been, actually. She was a survivor in someone else's mess, collateral damage in a war she hadn't signed up for. The real villain was somewhere out there. Maybe multiple villains, actually, considering how complicated this was getting, and they'd stolen 5 years from both of us in different ways. And the man who'd caused it? The one who'd played hero while secretly playing everyone else. Andrew Gray, with his expensive suit and his Rolex and his carefully constructed lies? Oh, I was going to redecorate his life with regret. I was going to make him wish he'd stayed disappeared. Because if there's one thing I'd learned in 5 years of grief-induced therapy and self-help books I pretended to read, it's that some people deserve to face consequences for their actions. And Andrew was about to get a masterclass in accountability, taught by a guy who had nothing left to lose and a suddenly very creative understanding of revenge. Rest, I told her, standing up from that horrible chair that had become my temporary home. Get your strength back. Because when you're ready, we're going to figure this out. We're going to protect that baby, fix this mess, and make sure the people who did this pay for it. All of them. She looked at me with something like hope in her eyes, which was probably misplaced because I had no idea what I was doing. But fake it till you make it, right? That's what all the motivational posters said. Time to find out if confidence and spite were enough to take down a criminal conspiracy. Spoiler alert, they weren't, but I was going to try anyway. Andrew tried to vanish, but I wasn't the same grieving fool he remembered. 5 years changes a person, and not always in the I found myself through yoga and meditation kind of way. Sometimes it changes you in the I'm petty enough to spend weeks planning revenge and resourceful enough to actually pull it off kind of way. I was 5 years smarter, 10 times angrier, and approximately infinity% more willing to burn bridges I'd already watched someone else blow up. He'd slipped out of the hospital that first night while I was still processing Anna's confession, probably thinking he could ghost his way out of this situation like he'd ghosted his way out of my life 5 years ago. Classic Andrew move. When things get complicated, disappear and let other people clean up the mess. But this time, I wasn't about to let him walk away without consequences. This time, I had something he didn't know about. Motivation, free time, and a truly unhealthy amount of anger that needed a productive outlet. I had contacts in cybersecurity, specifically my college buddy Derek, who worked for one of those firms that companies hire when they've been hacked and need someone to figure out where their data went. Derek owed me a favor from when I'd helped him move apartments and didn't judge him for his collection of vintage action figures still in their original packaging. And my cousin worked for the IRS, which sounds boring until you realize that the IRS is basically the most powerful organization in America, and they don't need warrants to ruin your entire financial existence. Janet had always been the overachiever of the family, and she took her job very, very seriously. Like, I reported my own grandmother for unreported garage sale income seriously. One phone call to Derek, another to Janet, and I had set in motion a chain of events that would make Andrew's life implode in the most beautifully bureaucratic way possible. Derek started digging into Andrew's digital footprint, bank accounts, shell companies, those fake medical research foundations Anna had mentioned. Turns out, when you're laundering money through charitable organizations, you leave a paper trail wider than the Grand Canyon, and Derek found it in about 48 hours. He sent me a file so thick with evidence it could have been used as a doorstop. Janet, bless her rule-following heart, took that information and ran with it like it was the Olympics of tax fraud investigation. Within a week, Andrew's accounts froze. All of them. Checking, savings, Those offshore accounts he thought were untraceable because he'd set them up through some shady lawyer in the Caymans. Frozen solid, like a popsicle in a deep freeze, and just as useful. His fancy condo in Lincoln Park, the one with the rooftop terrace and the marble countertops and the monthly HOA fees that cost more than my rent, got seized. Federal agents showed up with paperwork and zero sympathy, probably wondering why this guy had an apartment worth $1 million while claiming $30,000 a year in income. Math didn't math, as the kids say. His Porsche? Oh, that beautiful silver Porsche 911 that he'd posted on Instagram approximately 700 times with captions about hard work paying off and living the dream. Towed by a guy named Ron who I'd tipped an extra $50 to laugh while doing it. Ron was a professional. He gave it his best villain cackle, really committed to the bit, and even threw in a shoulda paid your taxes, buddy, for good measure. I watched from across the street, eating a hot dog from a street vendor, and it was the most satisfying lunch I'd had in years. When Andrew finally realized what was happening, when his cards started declining and his landlord called about the seizure notice and his car was gone, he called me. Of course he did. His number showed up on my phone, and I let it ring 3 times before answering, just to make him sweat a little. When I picked up, I could hear the rage and panic in his voice before he even spoke. "What did you do?" he screamed, and I had to hold the phone away from my ear because he was practically vibrating with fury. "My accounts are frozen. They took my car. They're saying I'm under investigation for fraud and money laundering. This is insane. You can't. You faked my wife's death, Andrew." I interrupted, my voice calm and cold and absolutely done with his nonsense. I was sitting in my apartment, feet up on my coffee table, drinking the fancy beer I'd bought to celebrate this exact moment. "I faked your financial future. Fair trade, if you ask me. Actually, I think I'm being pretty generous. I could have done a lot worse. This is illegal. I'll sue you." With what money?" I asked pleasantly. "Your frozen accounts? Your seized assets? Go ahead, hire a lawyer." "Oh wait, lawyers cost money. Funny how that works." I took a sip of my beer, savoring both the taste and the sound of his world crumbling through the phone. "Here's what's going to happen, Andrew. You're going to cooperate with the federal investigation. You're going to tell them everything about those foundations, those transactions, all of it. And then you're going to leave Anna alone. Forever. You don't call, you don't text, you don't even think about her or that baby. Clear. Silence on the other end, except for his heavy breathing and what might have been the sound of him punching a wall. Finally, you have no idea what you've done." "Oh, I know exactly what I've done," I said. "I've made sure you can't hurt anyone else. Consider it a public service." Then I hung up, blocked his number, and finished my beer. Honestly, it felt better than therapy. Way cheaper too. The baby, little Emma. Yeah, I renamed her to spite my own rule about getting involved, because apparently spite was my primary love language now. Had her mother's eyes. Not Anna's eyes. Claire's eyes. The ones I remembered from before everything went to hell, before fake deaths and money laundering and hospital calls that shouldn't have been possible. When I first saw her in the nursery, wrapped in one of those hospital blankets that look like they're made from the world's scratchiest material, she was sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that she'd been born into a situation that would require years of therapy to unpack. The nurse, a kind older woman named Patricia who reminded me of everyone's favorite grandmother. Let me hold her even though I technically wasn't family, wasn't the father, wasn't anything official except a guy who'd signed a bunch of paperwork because the universe has a sick sense of humor. Emma weighed almost nothing, this tiny bundle of human potential who'd done absolutely nothing to deserve being born into this circus. When she opened her eyes and looked at me, really looked at me, with that intense baby stare that seems to see straight through your soul, something shifted inside my chest that I wasn't prepared for. "Hey there, small person," I whispered, because talking in a normal voice to a baby felt wrong, like it would shatter something fragile. "Your family tree is a mess, your dad's a criminal, and your mom faked her death for 5 years, but none of that's your fault. You're just here, trying to figure out how fingers work and why adults are so weird. I respect that." She made a small noise, something between a grunt and a sigh, which I chose to interpret as agreement. Claire, or Anna, or whoever she'd become in the space between her old life and this new disaster, recovered slowly. The doctors said she was lucky to be alive, that delivering a baby while your body's shutting down from stress and malnutrition isn't exactly the recommended approach to motherhood. She'd been living rough for months, hiding from Andrew after he'd bailed, trying to figure out how to bring a baby into the world when you technically didn't exist according to any official records. No insurance, no support system, no backup plan except showing up at a hospital and hoping for the best. We didn't get back together. That needs to be clear, because this isn't one of those stories where love conquers all and everyone rides off into the sunset holding hands. Some stories don't need fairy tale endings wrapped up in neat bows with inspirational music playing in the background. Some stories end with people being honest with each other for the first time in years, acknowledging that what they had is gone and can't be recovered, and that's okay. That's actually better than okay, because pretending would have been worse. She sat in her hospital bed one afternoon, about 2 weeks after Emma was born, and we had the conversation we should have had 5 years ago if she hadn't been too scared and I hadn't been too trusting. "I loved you," she said, and the past tense hurt more than I expected. "I loved our life. But I was never going to let those people hurt you because of something I saw. Letting you think I was dead was the only way to keep you safe and away from all of this." "You could have told me," I said, but even as the words came out, I knew they weren't entirely true. Would I have believed her? Would I have let her go? Would I have done something stupid and tried to play hero, getting myself killed in the process? Probably. Okay, maybe you couldn't have told me. But Andrew was a mistake. She cut me off, her voice firm despite the exhaustion. He seemed like the answer at first, like someone who could actually protect me. By the time I realized what he really was, I was in too deep. The pregnancy was an accident, and his true colors came out real fast when things got complicated. She looked at Emma sleeping in the bassinet next to her bed. But I can't regret her. She's the only good thing that came from any of this. We did something better than getting back together. Forgiveness. Real forgiveness. The kind that acknowledges hurt and anger and betrayal, but decides that carrying all that weight around isn't worth it anymore. I forgave her for the 5 years of grief, for the funeral where I'd cried so hard I couldn't breathe, for the nights I'd laid awake wondering if I could have saved her. She forgave me for being the kind of person she felt she had to protect by destroying, for not being someone she could trust with the truth, for whatever inadequacies in our relationship had made her think disappearing was the only option. It wasn't dramatic. There were no big speeches or romantic gestures. We just sat there in that hospital room with its beeping machines and terrible lighting, and we let go of the past. Not forgot it. You don't forget something like that, but released it, like opening your hand and watching something heavy finally roll away. I helped her move somewhere safe after she was discharged, a small apartment in a suburb 40 minutes outside the city where nobody knew her as Claire or Anna, where she could just be a single mom trying to figure out life one day at a time. I paid off her hospital bills, which were astronomical because American healthcare is a scam designed to bankrupt people at their most vulnerable. My savings account took a serious hit, but money's just money, and it felt good to fix something concrete after months of dealing with problems that couldn't be solved with a checkbook. I set her up with a lawyer, a real one, not whatever shady character Andrew had connected her with, who specialized in identity issues and witness protection adjacent cases. Turns out there are legal ways to exist when you can't be who you used to be. Paperwork that can make a new identity legitimate. Processes for people who need to disappear for their own safety. It wasn't quick and it wasn't cheap, but it was possible. She sent me pictures sometimes, her and Emma smiling, alive, existing in a world that had finally stopped trying to kill them. Emma in a onesie covered in dinosaurs. Emma discovering her own feet with the kind of wonder that adults forget how to feel. Emma covered in what I assumed was pureed carrots, looking proud of the mess. Normal baby stuff, normal mom stuff. The kind of mundane happiness that people take for granted until they've lost it. I never visited. We both agreed it was better that way, cleaner, safer, less complicated. She had her life, I had mine, and Emma would grow up with a mom who loved her and a complicated origin story that would probably come out during her rebellious teenage years and cause all sorts of drama. But that was future problems. Present problems were handled, the bad guys were facing consequences, and everyone involved was still breathing, which felt like a win given how this whole thing had started. And every now and then, when my phone rings from an unknown number, I still flinch. My heart does that thing where it jumps into my throat, and my brain immediately starts catastrophizing about what fresh hell is calling me now. Because once you get a call from your dead wife giving birth, once you've lived through the kind of Tuesday that rewrites your entire understanding of reality, spam calls just hit different. That little moment of panic before you answer, wondering if it's a telemarketer trying to sell you car insurance or if your life is about to explode again, it never fully goes away. But most of the time, it's just spam. Just someone trying to reach me about my car's extended warranty, which is expired and I don't care. Just a robocall about lowering my credit card interest rate on cards I don't have. Just normal, annoying, everyday intrusions that remind me my life has returned to being boring. And boring, it turns out, is exactly what I needed. Boring is underrated. Boring means nobody's faking their death, nobody's laundering money through fake charities, nobody's having secret babies in ICU units. Boring means I can drink my terrible office coffee without my phone ringing with life-altering news. Boring means I get to exist without constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering when the next disaster will hit. I still think about Claire sometimes. Not the Anna version, but the original Claire, the woman I married and loved and thought I'd lost forever. I think about the life we could have had if she'd seen different numbers in that accounting ledger, if she'd looked away instead of digging deeper, if she'd trusted me enough to let me help carry the weight. But those thoughts are gentler now, less like open wounds and more like old scars that ache when it rains. Emma will be okay. Anna will be okay. And me? I'm okay too. In that relative way that people are okay after surviving something that should have broken them, but somehow didn't. I wake up, I go to work, I drink terrible coffee, and my phone stays mostly quiet. That's not a fairy tale ending, but it's an ending. And after everything, that's enough. My wife abandoned me when I was diagnosed with cancer at 29. You're too expensive to save, she said, cutting all contact. 5 years later, I survived and worked 3 jobs to pay medical bills. Last week, a lawyer knocked on my door with documents about a $63 million medical research inheritance. He smiled and said, the donor specifically requested, look, I'm not saying I believed in fairy tales or anything, but when you're standing at the altar promising someone forever, you kind of assume forever means more than just the good Instagram moments. You know, the whole package, vacations, arguments about whose turn it is to do the dishes, maybe even holding hands during the scary parts. But apparently, when they make you recite those wedding vows about in sickness and in health, there's this invisible asterisk nobody mentions. The one that says terms and conditions apply in font size -12. Mine had a real specific clause tucked away in the fine print. Unless saving you costs more than a mid-range sedan and requires actual emotional labor. I was 29 years old, which is supposed to be this golden age where you're figuring your life out. Maybe buying your first real furniture that doesn't come from IKEA. Possibly considering whether you want kids or just really committed houseplants. Instead, I was sitting in a hospital bed that smelled like industrial-strength bleach and broken dreams, with tubes snaking out of my arms like I was some kind of low-budget science experiment. The foredrip made this rhythmic beeping sound that I'd already started to hate, and the fluorescent lights overhead were doing that flicker thing that makes you feel like you're trapped in a horror movie nobody bothered to give a decent budget. That's when Melissa walked in. My wife. The woman I'd promised my life to approximately 14 months earlier at a ceremony that cost more than my car and featured a 3-tier cake nobody actually liked. She stood at the foot of my bed wearing those designer heels I'd bought her for Christmas, the ones she said made her feel powerful, and honestly, she looked more inconvenienced than concerned, like she'd just been informed her favorite brunch spot was closed for renovations. Her face had that carefully blank expression people get when they're about to deliver news they've already processed and moved on from, while you're still stuck at the starting line wondering what the hell is happening. I can't do this, she said, and her voice had this practiced quality to it, like she'd rehearsed this speech in the car on the way over, maybe ran through it a couple times in the hospital parking lot to make sure she hit the right notes of sympathy without actually committing to any real emotion. I remember blinking at her, my brain still foggy from whatever cocktail of medications they'd pumped into me that morning, thinking maybe I'd misheard. Maybe the cancer had already spread to my ears. Can't do what? I asked, because apparently even when your life is actively falling apart, You still need clarification on exactly how it's happening. You're too expensive to save, she said, and I swear to God, she said it with the same tone someone uses when they're canceling a streaming service they don't watch anymore. Not Netflix, more like one of those niche channels you subscribed to for one show and forgot about. Clinical. Businesslike. Already decided. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because what else do you do when your wife just put a price tag on your life and apparently you came in under budget for her concern? The laugh came out weird, kind of strangled, and it hurt my chest where they'd been doing tests all morning. I'm sorry, did you just cost-benefit analyze our marriage? Her mother, Darlene, because of course Darlene was there, lurking near the doorway like some kind of designer-clad vulture, stepped forward and nodded with this satisfied expression, like she'd just balanced a checkbook and everything came out neat and tidy. Darlene had never liked me, which I'd known from day one when she asked what my financial prospects were at our engagement dinner. Apparently, graphic designer with student loans wasn't the answer she was hoping for. Now she was standing there radiating vindication, her arms crossed over her Chanel blazer, probably thinking she'd been right about me all along. It's for the best, Darlene said, using that voice people use when they're pretending to be wise but are really just being cruel. You're young, Melissa. You can't throw away your best years on someone who's going to be a financial burden. Financial burden. That's what I'd been reduced to. Not a husband, not a partner, not even a human being fighting for his life. Just a line item on a balance sheet that didn't add up in their favor. Melissa wouldn't even look at me. She studied her manicure instead. Those perfectly painted nails I'd watched her get done just last week while I'd sat in the salon's waiting area scrolling through WebMD, trying to convince myself that my symptoms were probably just stress. I'm sorry, she said. But it was the kind of sorry people offer when they bump into you at the grocery store, not when they're abandoning their spouse in a cancer ward. How long have you been planning this? I asked, because some masochistic part of me needed to know. Did you decide in the parking lot? Or was this a conversation you had over coffee this morning? She flinched, just slightly, but didn't answer. Darlene put a hand on her shoulder, protective and possessive, already steering her daughter away from the mess she'd married. We should go, Darlene said. You've said what you came to say. And they left, just like that. Melissa's heels clicked on the tile floor. This sharp, staccato sound that echoed off the walls and seemed to announce my abandonment to the entire ward. Click, 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 each step taking her further away while I sat there connected to machines that beeped out my heartbeat like some kind of sad metronome. The door swung shut with this pneumatic hiss, and suddenly the room felt about 3 times larger and infinitely more empty. I stared at that door for probably 20 minutes, half expecting her to come back, to burst through with tears and apologies, saying she'd panicked, that she didn't mean it, that fear had made her cruel. But the door stayed closed, and the only sound was the drip and the distant murmur of nurses at their station down the hall. That morning, I'd walked into the hospital thinking I'd be dealing with a cancer diagnosis. That seemed like enough, you know? Like that should be the worst thing happening to me on any given Tuesday. But apparently, the universe had looked at my situation and thought, you know what this needs? Let's add some betrayal. Some good, old-fashioned abandonment. Really give this guy a story to tell. So yeah, I wasn't just diagnosed with cancer that day. I was diagnosed with being broke and inconvenient. With being not worth the effort. With being the kind of investment that didn't yield returns, at least not the kind that mattered to the woman who'd promised to love me forever. Turns out forever has a price point, and I'd just discovered I couldn't afford it. I looked down at my left hand, at the wedding ring I was still wearing, because taking it off seemed like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit yet. The gold band caught the fluorescent light, and I thought about how Melissa had slipped it onto my finger just over a year ago, her eyes wet with happy tears, promising me everything while meaning none of it. In sickness and in health, I whispered to the empty room, my voice cracking on the last word. Guess we should have defined our terms. The day after Melissa walked out, I discovered something interesting about hospital ceilings. They're absolutely covered in water stains that look like abstract art if you stare at them long enough. When you've got nothing but time and existential dread, you start seeing patterns. That one up there definitely looked like a duck wearing a top hat. That cluster near the corner could have been a map of Florida, or maybe just proof that hospital maintenance budgets were as depressed as I was. I counted them like other people count sheep, Except instead of falling asleep, I just got better at cataloging my misery in beige and yellow-brown splotches. The nurses had clearly gotten the memo about my situation because they started tiptoeing around my room like I was made of glass, or worse, like I was contagious with bad luck. They'd slip in to check my vitals with these sympathetic smiles that made me want to throw my Jell-O cup at the wall. Though to be fair, hospital Jell-O isn't really throwable. It just kind of jiggles disapprovingly and stays put. Nobody knew what to say to the guy whose wife had bailed faster than passengers on a sinking ship, so they just said nothing, which somehow felt louder than any conversation could have been. I was in the middle of identifying what I was pretty sure was a water stain shaped like Abraham Lincoln when my door banged open with enough force to make me jump, which hurt because everything hurt. And in walked this woman who clearly hadn't received the "be gentle with the abandoned cancer patient" memo. She was maybe 55, built like someone who'd spent her life pushing back against things that pushed first, wearing a blazer that had seen better days, and carrying a binder that looked thick enough to double as a weapon. "You gonna die? Or are you gonna get stubborn?" she asked, not even bothering with pleasantries like "hello," or "how are you feeling," or any of that fake sympathy everyone else was drowning me in. I blinked at her, wondering if the morphine drip had kicked in without me noticing and I was hallucinating confrontational social workers. "I'm sorry, is that an option on some kind of form I need to fill out? Because nobody gave me that paperwork." She laughed, this big, genuine sound that seemed completely out of place in a room that had been nothing but whispers and sad looks for the past 24 hours. "Ruthie Hall," she said, sticking out her hand like we were at a business meeting instead of in a cancer ward where my life was actively imploding. "Social worker, professional pain in the administration's ass, and your new best friend whether you like it or not." I shook her hand weakly, pretty sure I didn't have the energy to resist whatever hurricane had just blown into my room. "I don't have any money for whatever you're selling." "Good thing I'm not selling anything then," Ruthie said, pulling up the world's most uncomfortable-looking plastic chair and dropping that massive binder on my bed with a thud that made the four-pole rattle. "I'm here to make sure you don't die just because your wife has the emotional capacity of a parking meter." I actually laughed at that, which hurt my chest but felt good in a way that nothing had felt good in days. "You heard about that, huh?" "Honey, everyone on this floor heard about that," Ruthie said, flipping open her binder with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "Nurses' station gossip travels faster than hospital Wi-Fi, and the Wi-Fi here is terrible, so that's saying something. But forget about her, we've got work to do." She started pulling out papers, forms, pamphlets, printouts that looked like they'd been photocopied so many times the text was starting to blur. Charity programs I'd never heard of. Medical grants I didn't know existed. Financial assistance applications that required more information than my taxes. Payment plans that actually seemed designed for humans instead of trust fund babies. Drug company programs that would cover medications I couldn't pronounce, let alone afford. "This," Ruthie said, tapping the binder with one finger, "is what I call salvation through paperwork. It's not sexy, it's not fast, and it requires more signatures than a celebrity autograph session, but it works. We're going to apply for every single thing you qualify for, and probably some things you don't, because the worst they can say is no and you're already living through the worst, so what's a few rejection letters?" I stared at the mountain of papers that had just taken over my bed, feeling something that might have been hope trying to claw its way through the depression and abandonment. "Why are you doing this?" Ruthie looked at me over her reading glasses, and her expression softened just a fraction. "Because nobody should have to die alone just because they're broke. And because I'm really good at filling out forms and making administrators uncomfortable. It's like therapy, but I get paid for it." That night, after Ruthie had finally left, taking half the binder with her to photocopy in triplicate because apparently the universe required everything in triplicate, I was lying there trying to process the fact that a complete stranger was fighting harder for my life than my own wife had, when I heard humming. Low, melodic, the kind of humming that came from somewhere deep and genuine. Mr. Amos, the night janitor, was mopping near my door. I'd seen him around for the past few days, but hadn't really registered him as anything more than part of the hospital background noise. Just another person in scrubs pushing cleaning equipment and trying to make everything smell less like sickness and more like industrial lemon. He was older, maybe 60-something, with gray hair and the kind of face that suggested he'd seen pretty much everything and wasn't impressed by most of it. He wasn't talkative, didn't ask me how I was feeling, or give me those pitying looks everyone else seemed to have perfected. He just hummed gospel songs. I eventually realized old hymns my grandmother used to play on Sunday mornings when I was a kid. The kind of music that felt like someone wrapping a blanket around your shoulders without asking if you were cold first. I noticed he'd left something on my tray table. A pack of crackers, the cheap kind from the vending machine that cost $1 and tasted like cardboard, had ambitions of being food. At first I thought maybe he'd left them there by accident, or maybe he pitied me the same way everyone else did. But then he did it again the next night. And the night after that. Sometimes crackers, sometimes a granola bar, once an apple that looked like it had been smuggled out of the cafeteria. "You don't have to do that," I said one night, my voice rough from not using it much during the day. He paused his mopping, looked at me with these calm eyes that seemed to see right through all the bravado I was trying to maintain. "Everybody's gotta eat," he said simply, then went back to humming and pushing his mop across the floor in slow, methodical strokes. That's when I realized it wasn't pity. It was friendship, the quiet kind, the kind that didn't need a lot of words or explanations. The kind that showed up in the form of dollar store crackers and gospel hymns at 2 in the morning when you were lying in the dark wondering if your life was ever going to feel normal again. I had lost a wife, but somehow I'd gained a warrior social worker with a binder thick as a phone book and a janitor who communicated in snacks and spirituals. If this was rock bottom, at least it came with unlikely allies and the distant hope that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as alone as I felt. Chemo is a lot like having a jealous ex-girlfriend, except instead of just keying your car and posting vague accusations on social media, it systematically destroys everything you thought you knew about your body while claiming it's doing you a favor. It's violent in this quiet, insidious way, not a punch to the face, but more like someone slowly turning up the gravity until just existing feels like running a marathon through quicksand. And it's messy. Oh God, is it messy, in ways that the pamphlets with their cheerful stock photos of smiling cancer patients definitely don't prepare you for. The unpredictability was somehow the worst part, like living with a ticking time bomb that might go off during breakfast or at 3 in the morning, or while you're trying to have a conversation with a nurse about whether lime jello is actually food or just colored water with trust issues. My hair started leaving before I could even process what was happening, which felt weirdly appropriate considering Melissa had done the exact same thing. Except my hair was less dramatic about it. No speeches about financial burdens or clicking heels, just gradually abandoning ship in clumps that ended up on my pillow, in the shower drain, basically everywhere except actually on my head where it was supposed to be. I woke up one morning looking like a patchy lawn that had given up on life, and by the end of the week, I just had the nurse buzz it all off because pretending I still had hair felt more depressing than just accepting my new aerodynamic reality. At least my hair didn't take the car when it left, which was more than I could say for my ex-wife. So that felt like a minor victory in the world's saddest competition. Ruthie showed up during one of my better days, and by better, I mean I'd only vomited twice instead of my usual 4 times, with news that made me think maybe I'd hallucinated her entire existence. "Got you a job," she announced, dropping another stack of papers on my bed like she was dealing cards in the world's worst poker game. I stared at her, pretty sure the chemo had finally fried the part of my brain that processed reality. I can barely walk to the bathroom without needing a nap. What kind of job could I possibly do? "Remote data entry," she said, completely unfazed by my pessimism, which honestly should have been her superpower. "Company called Dataflow Solutions needs people to input information into spreadsheets. You can do it from your laptop, on your own schedule, and they don't care if you're doing it from a hospital bed or a yacht in the Bahamas. It's $12 an hour, which I know isn't going to make you rich, but it's $12 an hour more than you're making now. $12 an hour. In any other circumstance, I would have laughed at the idea of doing data entry for what amounted to slightly more than minimum wage. I had a college degree, damn it. I'd been a graphic designer with actual clients and a portfolio that didn't completely embarrass me. But graphic design required creativity and energy and the ability to stare at a screen for more than 15 minutes without wanting to throw up, and chemo had pretty much stolen all of those things from me. So $12 an hour to type numbers into boxes while fighting the urge to vomit? Yeah, that was exactly the level of ambition my life had achieved. "When do I start?" I asked, because apparently rock bottom came with a work-from-home opportunity. I started 3 days later, once Ruthie had helped me fill out more paperwork than should be legally required for a job that basically involved copying information from one place to another. Turns out, typing with hands that shake from chemo is its own special kind of hell, like trying to thread a needle during an earthquake while someone shouts random numbers at you. I'd sit there in my hospital bed with my laptop balanced on one of those rolling tables they use for meals, squinting at spreadsheets that all looked identical, inputting data about shipping manifests or inventory counts or whatever the hell data flow solutions actually did, because honestly I never really figured that part out and didn't particularly care. The nausea was my constant companion, this rolling wave that would hit without warning and leave me scrambling for the plastic basin the nurses had given me, which I'd started calling my coworker because we spent so much quality time together. I'd be in the middle of a spreadsheet, typing away, feeling almost normal, and then suddenly my stomach would stage a revolt, and I'd have to save my work, lean over, and introduce my coworker to whatever I'd managed to eat that day. Then I'd rinse my mouth, take a few deep breaths, and get right back to work, because nothing says living the dream quite like vomiting between data entries and pretending it's totally normal. But here's the thing about spite. It's a surprisingly effective fuel source. Every cell I filled in that spreadsheet felt like a middle finger to Melissa and her mother, to everyone who'd written me off as too expensive to bother with, to the universe itself for dealing me this particular hand of cards. $12 an hour doesn't sound like much, but when you're paying medical bills that look like phone numbers from another country, every penny feels like a small act of rebellion. I was surviving one spreadsheet at a time, and yeah, it was pathetic and exhausting, and sometimes I'd cry from sheer frustration when my hands wouldn't cooperate or my brain couldn't focus through the chemo fog, but I was doing it. I was still here, still fighting, still proving that I wasn't disposable. Mr. Amos seemed to understand this on some level that didn't require words. He'd show up during his rounds, humming those gospel songs that had become the soundtrack to my survival, and he'd just start fixing things. My bedside lamp that flickered like it was trying to communicate in Morse code? Fixed. My phone charger that only worked if you held it at exactly 37 degrees. Fixed with electrical tape and what I'm pretty sure was just sheer determination. Even my sense of humor, which had been pretty thoroughly destroyed by everything that had happened, somehow Mr. Amos helped fix that too, just by being present and calm and completely unbothered by the fact that I was a mess. "You're tougher than you look," he said one night, after I'd finished a particularly brutal shift of data entry that had taken me twice as long as it should have, because I'd had to stop every 20 minutes to either vomit or just stare at the ceiling and question my life choices. I looked at him, this quiet janitor who'd somehow become one of the most important people in my life without either of us really acknowledging it. "Don't set the bar too high," I croaked, my voice still rough from being sick. At this point, I'm surviving out of pure sarcasm and spite. If those ever run out, I'm screwed. He smiled, this small knowing smile that suggested he'd heard that kind of talk before and knew it for what it was, armor disguised as jokes. "Spites kept a lot of people alive longer than hope ever did," he said, then went back to mopping, humming something that sounded like Amazing Grace, but slower, sadder, like grace was something you had to fight for instead of something that just showed up. The hospital coffee became my other survival mechanism, though calling it coffee was generous. It tasted like someone had burned dirt, mixed it with regret, and served it in a styrofoam cup that leaked sadness. But it was free, and it was caffeinated, and it gave me something to do with my hands during the long stretches between data entry sessions when I was too wired to sleep, but too exhausted to do anything productive. I'd sit there sipping my terrible coffee, watching the sun come up through my window, thinking about how my life had become this weird combination of medical crisis and soul-crushing office work, and somehow I'd just keep going. Because what else was I going to do? Give up? Let Melissa and Darlene be right about me? Let cancer win without at least making it work for the victory? Absolutely not. I was going to survive out of pure stubborn spite if it killed me, which I realized was kind of contradictory, but whatever. Consistency wasn't really my strong suit anymore anyway. 3 months into my personal tour of hell, which included but was not limited to constant nausea, a bank account that looked like a typo, and the kind of exhaustion that makes sleeping feel like a full-time job, my phone rang with a number I'd deleted but apparently still had memorized, because trauma has a funny way of burning certain things into your brain, whether you want them there or not. For exactly one stupid, pathetic second, my heart did that thing where it jumps up all hopeful like a dog that doesn't understand its owner abandoned it at a rest stop 3 states back. Maybe she was calling to apologize. Maybe she'd realized what a massive mistake she'd made. Maybe she'd spent the last 3 months consumed with guilt and regret and had finally worked up the courage to beg for forgiveness. Yeah, I should have known better. Hey, Melissa said when I answered, her voice doing that fake casual thing people do when they're about to drop a bomb, but want to pretend it's no big deal. How are you feeling? I actually laughed, which turned into a cough, which reminded me that my body was still actively trying to kill me from the inside out. Oh, living the dream. Vomiting regularly, can't keep food down, basically look like a hairless mole rat, working a data entry job that pays less per hour than your manicure's cost. Just fantastic. Thanks for asking 3 months later. There was a pause, the kind that told me she was trying to figure out if I was being sarcastic or genuine, which was hilarious, because when had I ever not been sarcastic? I'm glad you're doing better, she said, completely missing the point in that special way she had of hearing only what she wanted to hear. Melissa, I'm not doing better. I'm doing slightly less terrible, which is not the same thing. But I'm guessing you didn't call for a health update. So why don't you just tell me what you want? Another pause, longer this time, and I could practically hear her gathering her nerve on the other end of the line. I talked to my lawyer, she finally said, and there it was, the real reason for the call. He says it would be better for both of us if you signed the divorce papers now. Cleaner, less complicated. We can just move on with our lives. I sat there in my hospital bed, which had become more familiar to me than my own apartment at this point, and felt something shift inside me. Not heartbreak. I'd already processed that during the 2 weeks I'd spent crying into hospital pillows that smelled like industrial detergent. This was something different. Something sharper. Better for both of us. I repeated slowly. That's interesting phrasing, considering one of us is fighting cancer alone while working 3 times as hard to stay alive, and the other one left because it was inconvenient. That's not fair, Melissa said, and I could hear the edge in her voice now. That defensive tone she always got when someone pointed out that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the hero of every story. I can't spend my best years watching someone fade away. That's not what I signed up for. You signed up for marriage, I said, louder than I intended, loud enough that a nurse walking past my room glanced in with concern. That was literally the entire point of the ceremony we spent $20,000 on. The vows, the cake nobody liked, your mother giving that speech about commitment. Remember any of that? You're being dramatic, she said, which was absolutely her go-to move whenever she didn't want to acknowledge that she might be wrong. I'm trying to do this the mature way. The mature way, I said, and I could hear the bitter laugh in my own voice, would have been sticking around. The mature way would have been having this conversation in person instead of abandoning me, and then calling 3 months later to make sure the paperwork goes smoothly. But sure, let's talk about maturity. See, this is exactly why we can't work, Melissa said, her voice going cold in that way it did when she decided she was the victim and everyone else was just being unreasonable. You're so angry all the time now. This isn't the man I married. You're right, I said, feeling something click into place, something final and irreversible. The man you married had hair and health insurance and a wife who pretended to love him. That guy's gone. This version survived cancer treatment and abandonment and data entry at $12 an hour. This version knows exactly what he's worth, and more importantly, what he's not worth wasting time on. What's that supposed to mean? It means you didn't watch me fade, Melissa. You left before the commercial break. You don't get to call now and act like you were there for the hard parts. You weren't. You chose not to be. So yeah, I'll sign your papers, but not because it's better for both of us. Because I deserve better than someone who puts a price tag on love and decides I'm not worth the investment. I could hear her breathing on the other end, could imagine her standing in whatever perfect apartment she was living in now, probably with her mother nearby, offering moral support and validation. I'll have my lawyers send them over, she said finally. All business now, the mask firmly back in place. You do that, I said. And Melissa? Lose my number. For real this time. I hung up before she could respond, my hands shaking from adrenaline and probably also from the chemo, and just sat there staring at my phone like it had personally betrayed me. which, in a way, it kind of had. Stupid thing wouldn't stop working just because I wanted to throw it against the wall and watch it shatter into a million pieces that represented my marriage. Mr. Amos showed up about 20 minutes later, pushing his mop cart with that steady, unhurried rhythm he had, humming something low and gospel-inflected. He took one look at my face and didn't say anything, just kept mopping, but he mopped slower near my bed, his presence this quiet, solid thing that somehow made the room feel less empty. My ex-wife just called. I said, not sure why I was telling him, but needing to tell someone who wouldn't try to fix it or make it better or offer platitudes about time healing all wounds. Wants me to sign divorce papers so she can move on with her life. Mr. Amos nodded, wrung out his mop with careful precision. Some people, he said quietly, don't know the difference between what costs money and what has value. I let that sit for a minute, turning it over in my head. Yeah, I said finally. Yeah, I think you're right. After he left, I found a sticky note in my bedside drawer, probably left over from when the nurses were tracking my medication schedule, and wrote on it in shaky handwriting, "You're not disposable." I stuck it on the mirror in my bathroom, right at eye level, where I'd see it every time I looked at my reflection, which currently resembled a before photo in one of those dramatic survival documentaries where the person barely makes it out alive but comes back stronger. I read it out loud a few times, testing how it felt in my mouth. You're not disposable. It sounded fake at first, like affirmations people post on Instagram next to pictures of their perfectly filtered lives. But I kept saying it anyway, every morning when I woke up and every night before I fell asleep, repeating it until it started to feel less like a lie and more like a possibility. The divorce papers showed up 4 days later via courier, because apparently Melissa's lawyer was efficient if nothing else. I signed them in the hospital cafeteria over terrible coffee and a turkey sandwich that tasted like cardboard's less ambitious cousin, and I didn't cry. Didn't feel much of anything except this weird sense of relief, like I'd been carrying something heavy for so long that I'd forgotten it was there until I finally put it down. I mailed them back that same day with a stamp I'd bought from the hospital gift shop, which felt appropriately depressing, ending your marriage via mail from a cancer ward. But it was done. Officially over. Officially unsubscribed from a relationship that had terms and conditions I'd apparently never read carefully enough. That night, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, bald, gaunt, connected to an 4-pole like I was on some kind of really depressing leash, and read my sticky note again. You're not disposable, I said to my reflection, and this time, for the first time, I almost believed it. I'd been in the hospital long enough that I'd started recognizing patterns in things nobody should ever have to notice, like how the lunch cart squeaked on Tuesdays but not Thursdays, or how the afternoon shift nurse always hummed off-key versions of 80s pop songs while checking vitals, or how the kid in the room next to mine cried every night around 8:30 like clockwork. Not loud crying, not the kind that brings nurses running, but this quiet, heartbreaking sound that seeped through the walls and made me want to punch something. Preferably the universe itself for being cruel enough to let children get cancer. His name was Tommy Cruz, and he was 7 years old, which I learned from overhearing nurses talking in hushed voices outside my door like I couldn't hear them through the paper-thin walls. 7. The age when you're supposed to be worried about homework and whether you're going to get that new video game for your birthday, not whether your white blood cell count is trending in the right direction. He had leukemia, the kind with a long medical name I couldn't pronounce even before chemo had turned my brain into Swiss cheese, and his parents couldn't visit much because they both worked 2 jobs and lived 3 towns away, which meant he was alone most of the time except for nurses who were too busy to do more than the basics. I met him officially about a week after he'd moved in, when I was shuffling down the hallway doing my daily walk that the doctors insisted was important for recovery, but felt more like an Olympic event given my current physical condition. He was standing outside his room in one of those hospital gowns that makes everyone look like they're wearing a decorated paper bag, staring at the vending machine like it held the secrets to the universe. It's rigged, I said, because apparently my social skills had degraded along with my immune system. The chips on the second row always get stuck. He looked up at me with these huge brown eyes that seemed way too old for his face, taking in my bald head and 4-pole with the kind of matter-of-fact assessment only kids can manage. You have cancer too, he said, not a question, just a statement of observable fact. Yeah, I said, because what else do you say? The not fun kind. Is there a fun kind? He asked, and I actually laughed, which hurt but felt worth it. Fair point. What are you in for? Leukemia, he said, pronouncing it carefully like he'd practiced. The doctors say I'm doing good though. Better than last month. Well, that's something, I said, and we stood there for a minute in companionable silence. Two bald guys in hospital gowns staring at a vending machine neither of us had the energy to fight with. That's when I noticed he was holding a plastic medicine cup, one of those little ones they use for pills, and he was looking at it with this intense concentration. What V you got there? I asked. Building materials, he said seriously, then explained that he'd been collecting the cups from his medications and trying to build towers, but they kept falling over because the cups were too light and the hospital room floor wasn't level. I looked at this 7-year-old kid who was fighting cancer and dealing with absent parents and being alone in a scary place. And he was worried about architecture and structural integrity. You know what? I said, I've got a whole collection of those cups in my room. Want to pool our resources and see what we can build. His face lit up in a way that made my chest hurt worse than the chemo ever had. And just like that, we became engineering partners in the world's most depressing construction project. We started small, basic towers made from stacking cups on top of each other, which fell over immediately and made Tommy giggle in this pure, unself-conscious way that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Then we got more ambitious, creating wider bases and experimenting with different stacking patterns. I'd sit on the floor of his room because the chairs were uncomfortable anyway, and we'd work in silence punctuated by his running commentary about load-bearing structures and weight distribution, concepts he'd apparently learned from watching building shows with his dad before all this happened. Mr. Amos started joining us sometimes, not saying much, but clearly supervising our architectural disasters while pretending to mop. He'd pause near our construction site, lean on his mop handle, and nod approvingly when we managed to get a tower higher than 3 cups without it immediately collapsing. Once he even contributed some extra cups he'd found somewhere, though I suspected he'd been stockpiling them specifically for our projects. You're really bad at this, Tommy informed me one afternoon when I'd knocked over our most ambitious tower yet, a spiraling structure we'd been calling the Leaning Tower of Medicine. Hey, I'm doing my best with shaky hands and chemo brain, I protested. Besides, you're the architect here. I'm just the assistant who follows orders. A really clumsy assistant, he said, but he was smiling, and I realized this was the first time I'd heard him talk without that undercurrent of sadness that seemed to follow him around like a shadow. We built skyscrapers between chemo drips, creating elaborate structures that would stand for hours before a passing nurse or a slight vibration would send them tumbling down in a cascade of plastic that sounded like rain. Tommy would document our creations with his mom's old phone, taking pictures from different angles like we were building actual architectural marvels instead of towers made from medical waste. He showed me his photo gallery once, dozens of pictures of cup towers in various stages of completion and collapse, each one captioned with names like the Empire State Building but smaller, and the one that lasted until dinner. His parents came to visit on a Saturday, both of them looking exhausted in that bone-deep way that comes from working yourself to death just to keep your head above water. His mom cried when she saw him, gathering him up in this fierce hug that made me have to look away because it felt too private, too raw. His dad shook my hand and thanked me for spending time with Tommy, his voice cracking on the words, and I wanted to tell him that Tommy was helping me as much as I was helping him, maybe more, but I didn't know how to say that without sounding like I was minimizing their struggle. After they left, Tommy was quiet for a while, sitting on his bed and staring at the cup tower we'd built that morning. A modest structure about 8 cups high that we'd managed to stabilize with careful placement. They have to work, he said finally, to pay for all this. The doctors and the medicine and everything. Yeah, I said, because what else could I say? The system was broken, and we were all just trying to survive it. When I grow up, Tommy said, his voice getting that determined quality kids get when they're making serious promises, I'm going to be rich. And then I'm going to make sure kids don't have to be alone in hospitals because their parents are working. I felt something crack open in my chest, something that had been sealed shut since Melissa left, since I'd realized how alone I actually was in all this. That's a good goal, I managed to say. Really good. That night, lying in my own bed and staring at my own water-stained ceiling, I thought about Tommy and his absent parents and his cup towers and his determination to fix a broken system when he grew up. I thought about how when Tommy laughed, really laughed, not the polite kind but the kind that came from somewhere deep and genuine, the cancer felt smaller somehow. Like it was still there, still trying to kill me, but it wasn't the only thing in the room anymore. I'd spent months thinking survival was just about me, about proving Melissa wrong, about making it through out of pure spite and stubbornness. But watching Tommy build towers out of medicine cups with hands that shook from treatment, seeing him smile despite everything he was going through, I realized something that should have been obvious but somehow wasn't. Surviving wasn't just for me anymore. It was for the people who still believed I had something to give. For a 7-year-old who needed someone to build ridiculous structures with between chemotherapy sessions. For Mr. Amos, who showed up every night with his gospel hymns and his quiet understanding. For Ruthie, who fought bureaucracy like it was a personal enemy. I wasn't just fighting cancer anymore. I was fighting to be the kind of person who deserved the faith these people, these unlikely, unexpected people, had somehow decided to place in me. And maybe, just maybe, that was a better reason to survive than spite ever was. Fast forward 5 years, and somehow, against all medical odds, statistical probability, and my ex-wife's confident predictions, I was still alive. Not just alive in the technical sense of having a pulse and occasionally remembering to breathe, but genuinely, stubbornly, spitefully alive in a way that felt like giving the universe a daily middle finger. The doctors used words like remission and remarkable recovery, with the kind of cautious optimism people use when they don't want to jinx things, and I'd gone from being the guy everyone expected to die to being the guy who absolutely refused to, which honestly felt like the biggest plot twist of my entire existence. But here's the thing nobody tells you about surviving cancer when you're broke. Beating the disease doesn't magically fix your bank account or erase the mountain of medical debt that's been accumulating interest like it's training for the Olympics. I'd survived, sure, barely, but I'd emerged on the other side looking at bills that had more zeros than I'd seen since my high school calculus class. The one I'd nearly failed because I was too busy being 17 and stupid to pay attention to anything useful. So I worked. Not one job like a normal person with reasonable life goals and healthy boundaries, but 3 jobs, because apparently my survival instinct had kicked into overdrive and decided that sleep was optional and free time was for quitters. During the day, I worked at a warehouse, one of those massive distribution centers that makes you feel like an insignificant cog in a machine designed by someone who actively hated human beings. I'd spend 8 hours lifting boxes that all weighed exactly enough to make your back hurt, but not enough to justify complaining about it, scanning barcodes until my eyes crossed, and trying not to think about how I'd gone to college specifically to avoid this kind of soul-crushing manual labor. At night, I stocked shelves at a grocery store, which sounds easy until you've spent 4 hours rotating canned goods and reorganizing cereal boxes, while fluorescent lights hummed overhead like they were slowly draining your will to live. There's something deeply existential about alphabetizing pasta sauce at 2 in the morning while a radio plays the same 6 songs on repeat, and you wonder if this is what surviving cancer was supposed to feel like. Exhausting, repetitive, and vaguely depressing in a way you can't quite articulate. And in between, during those precious few hours that normal people use for things like sleeping, or having a social life, or maintaining their mental health, I did data entry for Dataflow Solutions, still typing numbers into spreadsheets for $12 an hour like I had been in the hospital. Except now my hands didn't shake from chemo, and I only occasionally wanted to throw my laptop out the window instead of constantly. My diet had become 70% ramen. And I'm not talking about the fancy artisanal ramen from those trendy restaurants where a single bowl costs more than my hourly wage. I'm talking about the brick of sadness kind that costs 29 cents and tastes like salt had a fight with regret, and they both lost. I'd gotten creative with it out of sheer desperation, adding eggs when I could afford them, throwing in frozen vegetables that were on sale, occasionally splurging on hot sauce to pretend I was eating something that had flavor instead of just sodium and broken dreams. 20% of my diet was instant coffee, the cheap kind that came in a giant container and tasted like someone had burned disappointment and mixed it with water, but it kept me awake and functional, which was really all I was asking from my beverages at this point. I'd drink it black because milk cost extra money I didn't have, and I'd convinced myself that the bitterness was building character, though honestly it was probably just destroying my stomach lining. The remaining 10% was pure spite, meaning I was running on anger and stubbornness and the bone-deep satisfaction of proving everyone wrong. Every bill I paid off, every shift I completed, every morning I woke up still breathing felt like a personal victory over Melissa and her mother and everyone who'd written me off as a bad investment. Spite turns out to be surprisingly nutritious when you're trying to survive on basically nothing. I lived in a studio apartment that was generous in the same way calling a shoebox cozy is generous. It was small, cramped, and made you reconsider your life choices every time you walked through the door. The place smelled like a combination of burnt noodles and determination, which probably should have been concerning, but honestly just felt appropriate given my current life situation. The walls were so thin I could hear my neighbor, an elderly guy named Frank, sneeze from across the apartment, and then I'd hear him apologize to himself afterward, which was simultaneously depressing and kind of endearing. Frank and I had developed this weird rapport based entirely on the fact that we could hear each other's entire lives through the walls. He'd hear me come home at 3 in the morning from my grocery store shift, and I'd hear his TV playing westerns at a volume that suggested he was either hard of hearing or really committed to the experience. Sometimes he'd knock on my door with leftover casserole his daughter had brought him, claiming he couldn't finish it alone, but really just being kind in that subtle way old people have perfected where they help you without making you feel like charity. "You work too hard," he'd say, handing over a Tupperware container of something that actually contained vegetables and protein and other nutrients I'd mostly forgotten existed. "Just trying to pay off some bills," I'd say, taking the food gratefully because my pride had learned to take a back seat to my empty stomach. "Debt from the cancer?" he'd ask, because apparently my medical history was also audible through the walls. "Among other things," I'd say, and he'd nod knowingly, pat my shoulder, and shuffle back to his apartment to watch more westerns at volumes that could probably be heard from space. Still, despite the exhaustion and the ramen and the constant feeling like I was one missed shift away from financial collapse, I was proud. Genuinely, surprisingly proud in a way I hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. I'd paid off almost all my medical bills, not all of them, because that mountain was Everest-sized and I was climbing it with a spoon, but enough that I could see progress, actual measurable progress that showed up in my bank statements and made me feel like maybe I wasn't completely drowning anymore, just treading water in the deep end. No wife, obviously. Melissa was somewhere out there living her best life without the inconvenience of a sick husband, and I genuinely hoped she was happy in that distant way you hope for people you used to love before you realized they were never really capable of loving you back. No savings, because every penny I made went straight to bills or rent or ramen, with nothing left over for things like emergency funds or planning for the future or any of those adult concepts that seemed designed for people who hadn't spent their late 20s fighting cancer and abandonment simultaneously. No hair either. Weirdly enough, it had grown back after chemo, but in this bizarre curly pattern that made me look like I'd stuck my finger in an electrical socket and decided to keep the look. My barber had actually laughed the first time I came in, not meanly, but in that surprised way people laugh when confronted with something unexpected, and I'd just shrugged because honestly after everything I'd been through, weird hair barely registered on my list of concerns. But I was alive. Genuinely, stubbornly, impossibly alive. And yeah, my life looked nothing like what I'd imagined when I was younger and stupider and thought things like marriage and career success were guarantees instead of privileges. But it was mine. I'd built it from nothing, from the ashes of the worst thing that had ever happened to me. And every shift I worked, and every bill I paid, and every morning I woke up in my tiny apartment that smelled like burnt noodles felt like proof that I'd survived something that should have killed me. Sarcasm had replaced therapy, which probably wasn't the healthiest coping mechanism, but was significantly cheaper and didn't require scheduling appointments or talking about my feelings with a stranger who nodded sympathetically while taking notes. I'd learned to laugh at the absurdity of it all, the fact that I'd survived cancer only to be defeated by grocery store shifts and instant ramen. The way my life had become this weird endurance test that nobody had asked me to take, but I was apparently acing anyway. And some nights, usually around 2 in the morning when I was too tired to sleep but too wired to rest, I'd sit on the floor of my apartment eating ramen straight from the pot, because washing dishes felt like too much effort, and I'd think about how far I'd come from that hospital bed where my wife had told me I was too expensive to save. I'd think about Ruthie with her binder and her determination, about Mr. Amos with his gospel songs and his quiet kindness, about Tommy and his medicine cup towers and his dreams of fixing the world. And I'd realize that maybe I hadn't just survived. Maybe I'd actually won. It was a Tuesday night, which I only knew because my work schedule had Tuesdays highlighted in yellow as warehouse closing shift followed by grocery store opening shift, meaning I had exactly 4 hours between jobs to sleep, eat, and question my life choices in that order. The time was 8:17 p.m., which I noticed because I'd just gotten home from the warehouse and was doing my nightly ritual of taking off steel-toed boots that had molded to my feet in ways that were probably medically concerning, while simultaneously trying to decide if I had the energy to actually cook ramen or if I should just eat it crunchy straight from the package like the world's saddest potato chip. I'd chosen the cooking route because even my rock-bottom standards had limits, and I was standing in my kitchenette. Calling it a kitchen would be generous since it was basically a hot plate, a mini fridge, and counter space the size of a cafeteria tray, waiting for water to boil in a pot I'd owned since college when someone knocked on my door. Not the tentative tap-tap-tap of my neighbor Frank checking if I wanted leftover meatloaf, but 3 polite, confident knocks that sounded like they came from someone who'd never questioned whether they belonged somewhere. I looked down at myself, wearing sweatpants that had a hole near the knee and a t-shirt that advertised a 5K run I'd never actually participated in but had gotten for free from a work event, and seriously considered just pretending I wasn't home. People who knocked with that kind of confidence at 8:17 on a Tuesday night were either selling religion or selling something worse, and I had neither the energy nor the disposable income for either option. But curiosity has always been my fatal flaw, right up there with misplaced optimism and a tendency to make poor life decisions. So I turned off the burner, because burning down my apartment would really complete my run of bad luck, and opened the door. Standing in my hallway, looking like he'd wandered out of a lawyer commercial that played during daytime TV, was a man who screamed money in every possible way. He was maybe 60, with silver hair styled in that casually perfect way that probably cost more than my monthly rent, wearing an Armani suit that I only recognized because I'd once dated a girl who was obsessed with fashion magazines back when I had both hair and hope. He was holding a leather briefcase that looked like it had never seen the inside of a subway car, and he was smiling at me with the kind of professional warmth that comes from years of delivering news to people who weren't sure if they should be excited or terrified. "Mr. Lawson?" he asked, and his voice had that smooth quality that suggested he'd gone to one of those fancy schools where they teach you how to sound trustworthy while potentially ruining your life. "Depends on who's asking," I said, because I'd learned the hard way that admitting your identity to strangers could lead to anything from jury duty to subpoenas, and I really didn't need either of those things added to my current plate of chaos. "My name is Graham Aldrich," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a business card that probably cost more per square inch than my entire wardrobe. "I'm an attorney with Aldrich and Hunt. May I come in? I'm here about a rather substantial inheritance." I actually laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a full-on, doubled-over, probably concerning laugh that made my ribs hurt and my eyes water. Behind me, my ramen water started boiling over with a hissing sound that perfectly captured the absurdity of this moment. "An inheritance," I repeated, trying to catch my breath while also trying to figure out if this was some elaborate scam or if I'd finally snapped from exhaustion and was hallucinating. "Listen, Mr. Aldrich, I appreciate the effort, but the only inheritance I'm expecting is debt, more debt, and maybe some aggressive sarcasm from my inner monologue. You've definitely got the wrong apartment. Try next door. Frank probably has relatives with money." But Graham Aldrich didn't look embarrassed or confused or like someone who'd made a mistake. He just stood there with his leather briefcase and his expensive suit and his patient smile, waiting for me to stop laughing like a crazy person. "I assure you, Mr. Lawson, I have the correct address. The inheritance in question is approximately $63 million, and the donor specifically requested you by name." The world kind of tilted sideways for a second, and I had to grab the doorframe to steady myself because my brain had apparently short-circuited somewhere between 63 and million. "I'm sorry, did you just say 63 million? As in, with 6 zeros? As in, more money than I've seen in my entire life combined, including that time I accidentally looked at someone else's bank statement at the ATM? 63 million, yes," Graham confirmed. like we were discussing something completely normal instead of an amount of money that existed only in lottery fantasies and fever dreams. Perhaps we should discuss this inside? I have quite a bit of paperwork to go through, and your hallway, while charming, isn't exactly conducive to legal proceedings. I stepped aside because what else was I going to do? And Graham Aldridge walked into my studio apartment with the kind of grace that suggested he was used to much nicer surroundings, but was too professional to show it. He glanced around, taking in the futon that doubled as my bed and couch, the stack of ramen containers I'd been meaning to recycle, the pot of water still boiling over on my hot plate, and the general air of barely holding it together that permeated every surface. "Please, have a seat," I said, gesturing to my one chair, which I'd found on the curb 3 years ago and had never quite trusted to hold more than 150 pounds. I turned off the stove, moved my dinner dreams aside, and sat on my futon, which creaked in protest because even my furniture was exhausted. Graham set his briefcase on my makeshift coffee table, a plastic storage container I'd turned upside down, and opened it with the kind of precision that suggested he'd done this 1,000 times. Inside were folders, documents, papers with official-looking seals and signatures that made my eyes cross just looking at them. "I understand this must be quite shocking," he said, pulling out a folder and opening it to reveal what looked like a legal document written in that special language lawyers use that sounds like English but really isn't. The donor was very specific about wanting this to be a surprise, though I did advise that perhaps some warning might be appropriate. "Warning would have been great," I said, my voice sounding distant and strange to my own ears. "Maybe a text message? An email? A carrier pigeon? Literally anything that would have prepared me for a random lawyer showing up at my door talking about more money than I've earned in my entire life." Graham smiled, and it was genuine this time, not professional. The donor had a flair for the dramatic, I'm afraid. He wanted you to experience the full impact of his gesture. "He," I said, latching onto the pronoun because my brain was desperately trying to make sense of this situation. Who the hell do I know who has $63 million? I shop at discount grocery stores, and my most valuable possession is a coffee maker I got on sale. Graham pulled out another document, and I saw a name written at the top in official legal script that made my heart stop and restart in the space of a single breath. The donor was Amos Henderson, Graham said, watching my face carefully. "I believe you knew him as Mr. Amos, the janitor from Denver Memorial Hospital." I stared at him. Then I stared at the document. Then I stared at him again, because clearly someone had made a mistake, a huge, impossible mistake that was going to be really embarrassing when they figured it out. "Mr. Amos," I said slowly, like testing the words to see if they'd make sense coming out of my mouth. "The janitor. The guy who hummed gospel songs and fixed my phone charger with electrical tape and left crackers on my hospital tray. That Mr. Amos." "The very same," Graham confirmed. "Had $63 million. I continued, still not believing this was real, still waiting for the punchline or the hidden camera or whatever cruel joke the universe was playing. Indeed, he was quite wealthy, though he chose to live modestly. I started laughing again, except this time it came out more like crying, or maybe some combination of both that didn't have a name because it was the sound of someone's entire reality shifting on its axis. "He couldn't even spell my name right on the vending machine label he put on my 4-pole, I said, and tears were definitely streaming down my face now. "He called me Lawson for 3 months, and I never corrected him because it didn't matter, because he was kind and he showed up and he gave a damn when nobody else did. And now you're telling me he had enough money to buy a small island?" "He was a retired inventor," Graham explained, pulling out more documents that I couldn't focus on because my vision was blurry with tears. "He held several patents on medical delivery systems, for pumps, medication dispensers, that sort of thing. They're used in hospitals worldwide. He made a considerable fortune from the royalties, but he lived simply and worked as a hospital janitor because, according to his personal notes, he wanted to stay connected to the people his inventions were supposed to help." I put my head in my hands, overwhelmed by the sheer impossibility of it all. Why me? Why would he leave his money to me? Graham reached into the folder again and pulled out a single piece of paper, and his voice softened when he read it. In his will, he wrote, "For the man everyone left to die, but who kept living anyway. Tell him his wife was wrong. He wasn't too expensive to save. That sentence hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air out of my lungs and the strength out of my bones. I remembered Mr. Amos mopping my floor in silence. Remembered him leaving crackers and granola bars. Remembered him humming Amazing Grace while I cried into my pillow. I remembered thinking he was just being kind, just being a good person in a place where good people were in short supply. I'd never told him about Melissa. Never mentioned what she'd said about me being too expensive to save. But somehow he'd known. Somehow, he'd seen everything I was going through and decided that I mattered, that I was worth fighting for, that my life had value even when I couldn't see it myself. He changed my entire life. I said through tears, my voice breaking on every word. And I didn't even know his last name. Graham Aldridge gave me a moment to completely fall apart, which I appreciated because I was doing it spectacularly, crying into my hands in my crappy studio apartment while a lawyer in an Armani suit sat on my curb-fine chair and pretended not to notice that I'd devolved into a sobbing mess. Eventually, when I'd managed to pull myself together enough to form coherent sentences instead of just making wounded animal noises, he opened another folder from his briefcase of life-changing documents and started explaining exactly who Amos Henderson had been. Turns out the guy who'd fixed my phone charger with tape and determination wasn't just some janitor who'd decided to spend his retirement pushing a mop around a cancer ward. He was a legitimate genius, the kind of person who probably could have been running a Fortune 500 company or teaching at MIT, but instead chose to spend his days cleaning floors and humming gospel songs to sick people who needed it. Graham showed me patent documents with Amos's name on them, official government papers with seals and signatures that proved beyond any doubt that the man who'd left me crackers on my hospital tray had invented some of the most widely used medical equipment in the entire healthcare industry. This one here, Graham said, pointing to a patent dated 1987, is for an automated four-pump system that's currently used in approximately 60% of hospitals nationwide. And this one, he flipped to another page, is a medication delivery system that revolutionized how controlled substances are dispensed in medical settings. There are others, a total of 17 patents, all related to hospital equipment and medical technology. I stared at the documents like they were written in ancient hieroglyphics, my brain refusing to connect the man in these official papers with the guy who used to mop around my medicine cup towers with Tommy. He held patents on medical delivery systems used worldwide. I repeated, trying to make the words feel real in my mouth. The guy who I watched fix a broken mop handle with duct tape, and what I'm pretty sure was just optimism. He was worth over $60 million, Graham confirmed. But he lived like he made minimum wage. According to his financial records, he owned his house outright, a modest 3-bedroom in a middle-class neighborhood, drove a 15-year-old Honda Civic, and his biggest monthly expense was his donation to the hospital's charity fund. Graham paused, flipping through more papers. He worked as a janitor at Denver Memorial for 12 years after retiring from his company. Never told anyone who he really was. Just showed up, did his job, and went home. Why? I asked, because that was the part that didn't make any sense in a story that was already stretching the limits of believability. Why would someone with that much money and that much success spend their retirement mopping floors? Graham pulled out what looked like a personal letter, handwritten in shaky script that I immediately recognized as Amos's handwriting. I'd seen it on notes he'd occasionally leave, reminders about which vending machine buttons to avoid or which nurses would sneak you extra pudding cups if you asked nicely. He wrote this about 5 years before he passed away, Graham said. It was included with his will as an explanation of sorts. He handed me the letter, and I read it with tears blurring the words, having to blink repeatedly to make them come into focus. Amos's handwriting was messy but deliberate, the writing of someone who'd spent more time working with his hands than with pens. I made my money off sick people, the letter read. Built machines that helped them, sure, but also made millions doing it. Seemed wrong to spend all that money on fancy cars and big houses while the people my machines were supposed to help couldn't afford to use them. So I went back to the hospitals, not as an inventor or a businessman, but as someone who could be there in the middle of the night when folks were scared and alone. Figured that was worth more than any patent ever was. I had to stop reading because I couldn't see through the tears anymore, and my chest hurt in a way that had nothing to do with my cancer history and everything to do with the fact that I'd been in the presence of actual human goodness and hadn't even fully appreciated it at the time. He wrote specifically about you, Graham said gently, pulling out another document from his seemingly endless supply of papers that were systematically destroying my emotional composure. These are notes he kept, personal observations from his time at the hospital. Would you like to hear them? I nodded because apparently I was a masochist who enjoyed having his heart ripped out and put back together in the span of a single evening. Graham cleared his throat and read in his professional lawyer voice that somehow made the words even more devastating. Patient in 304, Lawson, I think, though I keep writing it wrong, got left by his wife today. She told him he was too expensive to save, right there in the hospital room, like she was returning a defective appliance. He hasn't stopped being polite to the nurses, though. Hasn't gotten mean or bitter, just keeps fighting. Reminds me why I do this job. He flipped to another entry. Lawson's working now, typing on his computer between getting sick from chemo. Ruthie got him set up with some data entry thing. Kid's determined, I'll give him that. Most people would have given up by now, but he just keeps going. Started building cup towers with the little Cruz boy, watching them laugh together while they're both fighting cancer. That's the kind of thing patents can't capture. Another page. Lawson told me today I'm tougher than I look. He's got it backwards. He's the tough one. Surviving on spite and sarcasm and stubbornness, but surviving. That's worth something. That's worth everything. Graham looked up from the notes, his professional composure cracking slightly. The last entry about you was written 3 weeks before he passed away. If something happens to me, make sure Lawson knows he was worth saving. Give him the money. Let him prove his wife wrong. Let him live the life everyone said was too expensive. I couldn't even pretend to have it together anymore. I was full-on ugly crying. The kind of crying where you make embarrassing sounds and your face gets all red and snotty and you don't care because the emotion is too big to contain in anything resembling dignity. This man, this quiet, humble man who'd spent his evenings mopping floors and humming hymns, had seen me at my absolute worst and decided I was worth $63 million. Had seen me getting abandoned and sick and desperate and thought, that's the one who deserves everything I've built. He couldn't spell my name right, I said through sobs, which was a stupid thing to fixate on, but somehow felt important. 3 months, and he kept writing Lawson on labels and notes, and I never corrected him because it seemed rude, and now he's left me enough money to never worry about bills again. He knew how to spell your name, Graham said quietly. I found the hospital admission records and his personal effects. He had your correct information written down. I think he just liked the nickname. That somehow made it worse and better at the same time. The idea that Amos had been gently teasing me, creating this small intimacy in the middle of a cancer ward where everything else was clinical and terrifying. He'd seen me as a person, not a patient. As someone worth knowing, worth caring about, worth leaving a fortune to. What am I supposed to do with $63 million? I asked, not really expecting an answer because it was more of an existential question than a practical one. Graham smiled, closing his folders with the efficiency of someone who'd delivered this kind of news before, though probably not to someone sitting on a futon in sweatpants with holes in them. According to his will, you're supposed to live. That's it. No strings attached, no requirements about how you spend it or what you do with it. He just wanted you to have the chance to live without worrying about money, without having to work 3 jobs, without having to prove to anyone that you're worth saving. He pulled out one final document. The official will, I assumed, based on the amount of legal jargon crowding every available space. There is one clause, Graham added. He requested that if you choose to donate any of the money, you consider helping other patients who've been abandoned by their families. But it's a request, not a requirement. The money is yours to do with as you wish. Of course, Amos had thought about other people even in his will. Of course, his last act of generosity came with a gentle suggestion about paying it forward. That was exactly who he'd been. Someone who saw suffering and tried to fix it, whether with inventions or donations, or just showing up with crackers and gospel songs. When did he die? I asked, realizing I didn't even know when I'd lost him. About 4.5 years ago, Graham said. It's taken this long to settle the estate and locate you. You've moved several times, and you weren't exactly easy to track down. 4.5 years. I'd been living in poverty, working myself to exhaustion, eating ramen and surviving on spite, while $63 million had been waiting for me, left by a man who'd believed I deserved better. The timing was almost funny in a cosmic joke kind of way. I'd already proven I could survive, already shown I was tough enough to make it without the money, and now here it was anyway. He really changed my entire life, I said, looking at Graham, and then at the papers spread across my upside-down storage container coffee table. And I never even got to thank him. Graham stood, gathering his documents with practiced efficiency. I think he knew, and I think that's why he did it. The next morning, my phone exploded like I'd accidentally become famous overnight. The news had broken. Cancer survivor inherits $63 million. And suddenly, everyone I'd ever met wanted to reconnect and offer their totally not suspicious congratulations. My voicemail filled up within an hour. Old classmates I was pretty sure had bullied me suddenly remembered how close we'd been. Distant cousins materialized out of nowhere with investment opportunities. Even my email was drowning in messages from people who'd forgotten I existed until I became worth something. Then came Melissa's call. "Babe," she said, and that nickname felt like a slap. "I made a mistake. A huge mistake. I panicked when you got sick. Can't we start over?" I actually laughed. "Let me guess, you've been soul-searching? Maybe in the last 24 hours since the news broke." Silence. All the answer I needed. "Melissa, I fought cancer, abandonment, and poverty without you. I can't survive another toxic relationship. We're done." "You're being cruel," she said. "No, I'm being honest. Lose my number." Her mother Darlene called next, coughing dramatically. "Sweetheart, your ex-wife is heartbroken." "Good," I interrupted. "So am I. About that $200 blender she took." I hung up and blocked them both. I didn't buy a mansion or a sports car or any of the ridiculous things people probably expected me to waste money on after suddenly becoming obscenely wealthy. Instead, I created the Amos Foundation for Abandoned Patients, a name that made lawyers nervous because apparently abandoned had legal implications, but I didn't care because that's exactly what it was for. People who'd been left behind by family or finances or a healthcare system that treated human lives like budget line items that needed to balance out. The Foundation's mission was simple and personal. We paid off medical debts for people who'd been abandoned during treatment, people like me who'd been told they were too expensive to save, and then had to figure out how to survive anyway. We covered bills for patients whose families had walked away, whose insurance had maxed out, whose GoFundMe campaigns had failed to go viral, because apparently suffering isn't compelling content unless it comes with good photography and a catchy hashtag. Within the first year, we cleared over $12 million in medical debt. $12 million. That's not money. That's hundreds of lives, hundreds of people who could finally breathe again without drowning in bills that had more zeros than hope. We worked with hospitals across the country, identifying patients who fit our criteria, reaching out quietly, because nobody wants their abandonment broadcast like some kind of tragedy porn. Sometimes we'd get thank you letters that made me cry in my office. Now an actual office instead of a studio apartment that smelled like burnt ramen. Sometimes we'd get no response at all, and that was fine too because dignity doesn't require gratitude. I kept Amos's old janitor badge on my desk in a simple frame. No fancy display, just the laminated ID card with his photo looking exactly like I remembered him. Calm, kind, completely unimpressed by the chaos of the world around him. Visitors would ask about it sometimes, confused about why a millionaire philanthropist had a janitor's badge as his most prominent decoration, and I'd tell them the whole story. About the man who mopped floors and hummed gospel songs and left crackers for dying patients who had nobody else. About the inventor who chose connection over comfort, service over status. About the person who saw me at my worst and decided I was worth everything. Sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep, a lingering side effect of trauma that money couldn't quite fix, I'd imagine Amos walking into heaven's break room, pouring himself terrible coffee, and saying to whoever was in charge up there, "Told you that kid would make it." I never heard from Melissa again after blocking her number, which was exactly what I'd hoped for. Rumor had it she was dating a chiropractor now, which I learned from a mutual friend who thought I'd want to know. I didn't, particularly, but I did hope she'd finally found someone who could adjust her morals along with her spine, because clearly they'd been misaligned for years. As for me, I was cancer-free, debt-free, and finally living proof that sometimes the people who abandon you end up watching you on the evening news, probably choking on their expensive wine while you're out there changing lives with money you earned by refusing to die when everyone said you should. I guess I wasn't too expensive to save after all. Just too valuable for the wrong buyer.